Chapter 832. Evil Guest? I've always paid for my meals. In the morning mist and wetland, Su Li's unrestrained rebuttal rang out. It was obvious that he did not intend to show any mercy to a certain person's conclusion that was full of life insights. You walk among the stars, shaking your big ass everywhere and pretending to be an evil guest. Then what am I? Don't I need to pay for the meal on your table after it's finished? Then, after so many years, you just sit down and sigh with a few words and call it a day? Even if you can threaten me, even if I'm old, shouldn't you at least treat me with a better attitude? Respecting the elderly is a form of courtesy. Fengyu raised his eyebrows and roared at him. Yes, I didn't take care of you much in the East Forest, but without that cannon of mine, do you think that the infatuated princess, who thinks that she can tear apart the universe with brute force, could have escaped from that deadly prison? White Chaosher glanced at him coldly, with an expressionless face. Sula had long guessed that the main cannon of the battleship that came from beyond the atmosphere and blasted through the snowy night had something to do with the man in front of him, but he had no intention of thanking him at all. He said mockingly, "Old people are often as smug as children. It's really hard to respect them. I know that you are still immersed in the self-identity disorder and the inner struggles of those so-called artistic youths, so I don't blame you for losing your composure. I will take responsibility for you." Fengyu paused for a moment and said calmly, "Go to the Empire, little guy. I believe that as long as you return to the Empire, the stories that will happen in the future should be able to mend your fragile heart and satisfy the ridiculous morals in your heart." Sulu looked at him in silence, waiting for his explanation. Regarding this war, there is only one result. Between the Federation and the Empire, whoever can integrate the resources more effectively will obtain the final victory. In other words, the one who monopolizes power will definitely win. The president of the Federation, who likes to pretend to be a minor, saw through it a long time ago. That's why he wants to have power like an emperor. The people and the parliament are easy to deal with, but the few big families are a problem that he has to deal with. The problem with the Federation lies in the families that share a symbiotic relationship with it. If we ignore them, they will consume the flesh of the Federation, causing it to age, harden, and decay day by day. But if we try to dig out these tumors, the Federation will bleed to death. Fengyu said mockingly, "If I can't do it, who else can? On the contrary, your emperor in Left Sky Star area is cold-blooded, a bastard, and a hypocrite. Look at how he dealt with Keaton and the other princes. In the next 30 years, no one can shake his throne. Therefore, the Empire will definitely win." This was a war that spanned across the River of Stars and was very likely to set the entire universe ablaze. Yet, this man with a mouth full of rotten teeth in the morning mist casually pointed out the final outcome. Some of the 3 people present were willing to believe it, while others were unwilling to. However, they had to admit that even though this reasoning was simple and even unreasonable, since it came from his mouth, it was extremely powerful. Just like how he was so confident and even narcissistic when he mentioned the problems within the Federation, it was completely unquestionable. Even he could not overthrow the 7 great families, so how could the current government do it? You are not a guy who can watch your biological parents beat your adoptive parents until they are covered in blood without saying anything. Fengyu looked at Su Lo and said, "Teacher wants peace. Right now, you should be in great need of this mental soothing agent. Therefore, you must return to the Empire and return to the side of that emperor of yours. You can even try being the emperor for a few days for fun." Under the winter tree, the great teacher stood up with the help of the tree trunk. Rubbing his back, he said, "The one who wants peace is my father. I will give it to him. I don't need a guy like you to meddle." White Chaosher put down the wine cup in his hand and looked at Su Le. "What we want is victory. Peace can only be the spoils of war after victory. But right now, I don't want anything because these things have nothing to do with me." Su Le shook his head and looked at Fengyu. "In the end, my life has been played by you people. Please allow me to raise my middle finger to you old people from the depths of my heart. Furthermore, I don't want to continue being controlled by you people in the future." He raised his left hand. The metal bracelet on his wrist seemed exceptionally holy in the milky mist. I will not return this bracelet to you. Just treat it as the compensation you gave me on behalf of everyone in the first half of my life. Then, he shrugged and continued. Furthermore, I believe that I deserve that sentence more than you do. In this aspect, I have the confidence to show off a little. Fengyu looked at him and spread out his hands. I have already returned that stupid electronic watch of yours to you. I snatched it from that idiotic student of yours.
Sula did not back down.
I am very unhappy that you threw away the thing I gave you to someone else. Fengyu said in disgust. I mainly wanted to tell you that I am still alive. I don't want a little boy in this world to cry whenever he thinks of me. He scratched his head and said, You should have finished asking your questions. It's my turn. I just want to know what's going on between you and that broken computer, and where did you get that weird permission from? I accepted the initiative to contact you. Sula gave a simple answer. Some remnant information in the chip activated a backdoor program of the Federal Central Computer. Thus, I became the first target of protection. Remnant information? Fengyu's brows furrowed as he thought of some very important questions. However, he did not explain anything. After a moment of silence, a faint self-deprecating smile appeared on his face as he said, I escaped under its nose for several decades. Only now do I know that I actually had 71 chances to talk to that guy directly. Do you regret it? Sula mocked.
No.
Fengyu raised his eyebrows and laughed. Talking to a stupid computer directly is too stupid. The strange and thick fog in the morning finally could not withstand the invasion of the sun and gradually showed signs of dissipating. Sula looked at the uncle's weathered face and said, Uncle, I don't care if you really dismantled that ship or not, but I know that you have a way to take them away from the Federation. Please take them away. Hearing this, Hui Chaosher, who was under the winter tree, frowned. She did not expect that Sula would still insist on not returning to the Empire with her under such circumstances. What about you? Fengyu looked at his student with a smile that was not a smile, and said, You insist on staying. Master Fan suddenly thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. He took 2 steps forward from under the tree and said in shock, Kid, do you really want to learn from that guy in the 8-part opera and commit suicide in the end? Although you call this a hero plan, and the Federation once made me a hero, I know very well that I am not cut out to be a hero. Of course, I will not commit suicide. Sula looked at them and said with a smile, We are not in the same boat, at least for now. Therefore, I will not board your boat. Besides, who knows when I will have my own boat. You want to stay and compare yourself with that stupid computer? You want to stay and test the level of evil in people's hearts? Fengyu replied with a smile, Being a hipster is indeed a disease. You will die. I don't think the charter computer is very strong. I have endured it for the past 2 days by myself.
No.
Fengyu said with a slight mocking tone, You think it is not strong because it does not want you to think it is strong. Even if it is a stupid computer, it is still the most powerful stupid computer in the universe. Regarding these aspects, you are still too inexperienced. Therefore, you cannot understand its current thoughts. In about 3 minutes, a dense barrage of missiles and battleship main cannons will cover the area we are in now. Fengyu took down a broken computer from the broken cart and pointed at the data stream on the screen of the workbench. He looked at the 3 of them and said with a smile, I have never really defeated it in my life, but believe me, as long as I am alive, it will not be able to defeat me. On the 2-dimensional screen in the basement of the Bureau of Proclamation, the data stream compiled by the dark green mechanical language was still flowing. Just like how it had been for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, there was no pause or change. The Federal Central Computer calculated all the missions with a cold mechanical mind and ordered them strictly according to the order and the degree of danger. For it, Fengyu, who had countless identities, was undoubtedly a more important target than Sula. From the moment the Morning Dawn launched its main cannons during the riot in the military prison of Qingcheng, the anomalies of missions 1 to 71 and 73 entered its field of vision. It used the fastest speed to draft a capture or elimination plan, which it named Bait. Just as Fengyu had deduced, the real ability of the Federal Central Computer was definitely more powerful than what Sula had felt these days. However, the powerful and unshakable priority of the plan had created such a situation. If it was described in terms of anthropomorphic thinking, it was probably deliberately showing weakness to lure more important enemies into the encirclement. The overlapping of anomalies and the arrival of additional important targets directly triggered the relevant program. From the perspective of the plan, the Federal Central Computer's arrangements and calculations were very precise and perfect. There was nothing to nitpick about. The elimination plan was to be carried out in an uninhabited wildlife sanctuary. Although the dense fog affected the fixed location of the military satellite to a certain extent, as long as the amount of ammunition was increased, it could still guarantee that the targets would be completely eliminated in the first place. The 3 battleships on standby outside the atmosphere were ready to launch their main cannons. A certain land missile base in South Kazhou had launched a powerful missile. However, as time passed, the missile was still not launched. The plan drawn up by the Federal Central Computer had encountered some kind of setback. It had nothing to do with the data stream that had quietly snuck into the light and then disappeared like a thief. The Federal Central Computer had already done the core data protection. The green data stream on the 2-dimensional light screen flowed slowly. After an unknown amount of time, the image of the eye that appeared once every 5 seconds quietly emerged. It calmly and silently watched the humans in the Bureau of Proclamation building and the officials who were fiercely debating in the official residence. It could not understand why its plan was so perfect and simple, but these humans were unable to carry it out. It had been at least 7 minutes since the alarm was sent and the request was submitted. However, the humans who had the authority still had not made a decision. Unable to directly carry out physical operations, the Federal Central Computer had to work under the orders of the humans. Therefore, it could only wait in silence. It could not even feel angry. It was so lonely and lonely. Chapter 8:33. In the underground meeting room of the president's residence, the heated argument was still going on. The National Security Advisor slammed the table angrily and yelled at the Bureau of Proclamation official in front of him, "There are only 4 targets in total, and we have to send out 3 warships. And hundreds of Inferno missiles are going to be fired at them? Who the fuck came up with this plan? Is there something wrong with the charter computer? Sir, those aren't normal targets." The current situation is that even if the Bureau of Proclamation activates the program to open the electronic fence, by the time the special forces arrive, those 4 people will have already escaped. The most important thing is that none of us are confident that we can capture these people with our ground forces. The Deputy Minister of Defense retorted with a gloomy face, "Hundreds of Inferno missiles and warships do seem exaggerated, but we really need such powerful firepower. If the charter computer didn't make a mistake, other than Sulu, the Empire's princess, and the Empire's great teacher, the other person is the mechanic Yufeng." 6 years ago, when the 4 military regions carried out the last assassination mission, they sent out mecha teams and warships, but they still let him escape. Sir, I hope you won't forget this point. Sitting at the end of the long table, General Li Jiedu had been silent the whole time. He looked at the operation plan in front of him thoughtfully. His digital pen lightly moved, and no one knew what he was thinking. The old man who appeared in the middle of the wetland was his uncle, the person he was most wary of after that night of coffin support. He had hoped countless times that this person wouldn't appear, but in the end, that person still came. As a member of the Federation, of course I know the importance of those 4 targets, but I have to remind you of one thing. The National Security Advisor pointed at the electronic map on the screen and roared, "The protected area is close to the back of Macho Mountain. The target location is less than 7 kilometers away from the manor. That is the Tai family area recognized by the government. What do the missiles and warships mean? Could it be that they want to declare war on Lady Tai? Or is the government ready to declare war on all 7 families?" He took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat on his forehead. Coldly looking around, he said in a hoarse voice, "You are only thinking about the war between the Federation and the Imperium, but I am more worried about whether the Federation will officially enter a civil war because of this attack." There was silence in the conference room. The generals and officials knew very well that what the security advisor was worried about was very frightening. However, the Federation would not allow such a situation to happen if they did not launch an attack, while the Empire's princess was right in front of them. Li Jiedu, who had been silent all this while, suddenly spoke. Launch a warship attack. The Deputy Minister of Defense beside him frowned and said, the main cannon of the warship is an instant attack. Logically speaking, there should be no problem. However, Mechanic Yufeng can't use conventional logic. Without missiles to increase the coverage, the attack is very likely to fail. At this moment, the heavy alloy door of the conference room slid open smoothly, and President Pabre, who had forcibly interrupted an important trip, hurried in. He waved his hand to stop everyone from standing up and saluting, and said in a deep and powerful voice, execute the plan according to the central computer. The generals and officials in the conference room were slightly stunned. Their expressions were all different, and they immediately began to implement the battle plan. The president placed his hands on the table and silently looked at the light screen above his head. His expression was abnormally solemn. The Madam of the Back Mountain had just made a decision that shook him. She had opened up the Crystal Mining Consortium. In the face of such a concession, the government had to make a corresponding response. The Parliament Hill needed a very long time to review the matter. However, could the government's response be the attack of the warship's main cannon and countless missiles? In terms of political stability, the president should have chosen a more reliable method, but he did not. He directly and forcefully issued the order to attack, because in the center of that wetland were two important figures of the Empire, the most wanted criminal of the Federation, and more importantly, Su Lo was there. President Pabre looked at Li Jiedu and said expressionlessly, I will immediately call Lady Tai to avoid causing her to make a wrong judgment. That madam will not make a wrong judgment. The troublesome thing is that she is very willing to make a wrong judgment and then seek the relevant benefits, Li Jiedu calmly replied. Some people can use the overall benefits of the Federation to bargain, but we cannot. The president looked at the satellite image on the light screen and looked at the ground that was faintly discernible in the fog. He said indifferently, we must be responsible for the Federation. In the center of the wetland, the winter tree gradually became more and more blurred behind the several figures. Mechanical calculation is never a real thought process. The seemingly omnipotent central computer of the Federation is actually not that scary. No matter how powerful the tool is, it is just a broken tool in the hands of the stupid and indecisive human. Uncle Fengyu reached out and took the box of brand 37 cigarettes from Su Lo, who was pushing the cart. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He walked slowly and talked slowly, completely ignoring the countdown and the possibility of the imminent terrorist attack. His disdainful and indifferent expression was incomparably powerful and vigorous. There is a theory that the key point of the official origin of human beings before the catastrophe was learning how to use tools. In my opinion, it is very regretful or shameful that human beings have not evolved a bit since then, especially the way they use tools is still so clumsy. Fengyu glanced at the broken light screen of the broken computer on the broken cart and shrugged. Even if the central computer has protected the core data, it is meaningless. It has to wait for someone to give the order. But people have to think, if they throw a bomb here, what will the old woman behind the mountain in front think? I didn't choose this place blindly. On the other side of the broken cart, Huai Chaoshi suddenly frowned and asked, you chose this place? Of course. Fengyu proudly lifted the black hair in front of his forehead, revealing his true colors below. The data in your intelligence department were all left by me. Otherwise, which agent of the Imperium do you think could have chosen such a good place for you? Su Li's expression changed slightly, and he lowered his head and continued to push the cart in silence. Although he had roared angrily about the miserable life of child labor earlier, some things had been deeply rooted in his bones, such as working as a coolie for the uncle, and such as standing on the Federation's side habitually and thinking as a person of the Federation, especially a soldier of the Federation. Can your expression not be so stiff? Fengyu looked at him mockingly. You are not a person of the Federation, I am. Besides, other than your crazy and perverted sister, who do you think can use this data? At this moment, a low humming sound came from the sky far away, as if several grand pianos were playing at the same time in an empty room. Sulu narrowed his eyes, but he did not turn around. He knew that countless missiles were tearing apart the fog and flying toward the winter tree behind him. Feng Yu and Huai Chaoshi, who were walking on the two sides of the broken cart, were indifferent and did not turn around. But Great Teacher, who was walking at the front, looked back, only to discover that the morning fog where everybody had been had strangely disappeared. The wetland was clear and bright, and the winter tree had disappeared at some point. Where it had been standing stubbornly before, a few soundless black holes could be vaguely seen. 300 ardent fire, 2 missiles were launched, and countless explosions rang out one after another, as if the deepest drum of an orchestra was beating the ground. The wetland began to tremble. The frost-white grass, the gradually solidifying ice, and the remaining branches were dismembered by the cheers of the high-energy explosives. The debris that they turned into at the cost of their lives drifted in the air. Before they could fall, they began to burn fiercely again, turning into a real fire that covered several kilometers. At the edge of the raging fire, there were 4 people who seemed to be leaving slowly, but were actually leaving quickly. They were not riding horses, nor carrying sticks. They were just pushing a small cart. They were not afraid or flustered. Even the burning wilderness behind them could not make them stay silent for a while. The uncle leaned against the broken cart lazily with a cigarette between his lips, blowing a cheerful whistle that was not sad at all, as if he were playing the accompaniment for the terrifying explosion behind him. Walking to a nameless puddle, Sulu looked at the uncle next to the cart and could not help but remark, "Uncle, I have to admit that your narcissism is very reasonable. You are indeed vigorous." "This is vigorous? When I was vigorous, I was much more vigorous than this."
Pure seafood.
Feng Yu looked at him and said mockingly, "To deal with that broken computer, it is not enough to understand it. The more important thing is to understand those who use it. What are those government officials and generals thinking in their heads? What are they hesitating about? And what can we use in between?" Tools were used by humans. To fight against a powerful tool was, in fact, to fight against the people who used it. This seemed to be a very simple principle, but Sulu knew very well how difficult it was to use this method to find the gaps between those lights, because the complexity of the human thought pattern was even more complex than that of the charter computer. "This is not difficult." Feng Yu looked at him and said indifferently, "When you turn this judgment into some kind of vague instinct like me, there won't be any problems. But since you insist on not getting on my boat, when you are chased by that broken computer in the future, don't cry and ask me to be your uncle." Sulu listened silently and seriously. Then he smiled, knowing that the uncle had taught him the most important lesson today. Then his smile gradually faded, knowing that it was time to say goodbye after they had just reunited. What made him a little confused and at a loss was that this separation was the result of his own persistence, and he could not even clearly explain why he was so insistent. Feng Yu removed the cigarette from between his lips and raised his head to look at the steep cliff not far away. His usually arrogant and indifferent face that was full of vicissitudes of life suddenly showed a rare trace of emotion. The old man said that he had already entered this gamble and would definitely win. "It probably means that he has seen through you. You little guy are a stinking rock, and you won't give up until you are smashed into pieces." Feng Yu said thoughtfully, "You are all the same kind of people, always liking to gamble with your lives. But in my opinion, life should not be wasted like this. If you care too much about something, you will be dragged into the abyss by those things, and it will be difficult to rise again." He raised his head and looked at the clear blue sky that was gradually revealing its true appearance. He said mockingly, "Just like this crappy computer of yours. More than 10 billion dogs are chained to the Federation, but in the end, you have become a dog for more than 10 billion people." Chapter 834. Anything that you care about can be a dog chain?
Yes.
Including hometown, lover, hot-bloodedness, honor, comrades?
Yes.
Sulu looked at the white cliff reflected in the shallow pool in front of him. After a moment of silence, he raised his head and looked at Feng Yu with a smile. I also don't want to be tied by a dog chain, even if it's related by blood or something like that. So I have to break free with force, and then walk my own path. Foamy looked at him calmly. Even if it means death? Even if it means death. Sula turned around and looked at Huai Caoshir's messy and slightly dirty purple hair. He looked at her ordinary face and looked at her small eyes. Sorry, I'm very grateful for you coming, but I really can't leave with you. After saying this, he hesitated for a moment and then opened his arms somewhat stiffly. Huai Caoshir's expression froze slightly. She opened her arms like him, right arm slightly up, left arm slightly down, and slowly and hesitantly took a step forward. The two of them crossed their arms somewhat awkwardly. Their upper bodies leaned forward and gently hugged like two pieces of wood.
Then they separated.
Can you promise me one thing? Sula looked into her eyes and said softly. Huai Caoshir looked at him quietly. Sula hesitated again and said with some difficulty, the thing you took from Zhou is too big of a threat to the Federation. After we return to the Empire, can I trouble you to destroy it? Huai Caoshir's eyes gradually narrowed. There was some coldness and faint disappointment in her eyes. Sula knew that there was no way for him to not be angry when he said something like this at this moment. He lowered his head and said, if that thing falls into your hands and is cracked, too many people in the federal forces on the front lines will die. Although probably no one thinks so right now, some of them are my subordinates and comrades after all. Then, have you ever thought about how many fewer Imperial soldiers would die if that little blue device was cracked? And they are your real compatriots? Huai Caoshir narrowed his eyes and slowly clenched his fists. After a while, he slowly released them and said with a trace of tiredness that was difficult to suppress, I promise you.
Thank you, Sula said.
I know you're disappointed. I'm sorry. Huai Caoshir looked at him coldly and said, I know what kind of person you are, so my real disappointment is that since you don't want to go home with me, your last words before leaving are actually this. That wasn't the last sentence. Sula looked at her and paused for a very long time. Then he said, I will go to the Empire to see your sister. Hearing these two words, Huai Caoshir's narrowed eyes slowly relaxed. The lines and expression on her face that seemed to be carved from steel suddenly melted into the branches of spring. She reached out and patted Su Li's shoulder. Without saying anything, she turned around and left, crossing the river of stars to come to the Federation, disregarding the risk of life and death, even throwing the Empire and all of her responsibilities to the back of her mind. This most powerful princess just wanted to bring her younger brother home. Even though her wish was not fulfilled, she was already satisfied to hear the last two words. The wilderness was full of the pungent smell of residual fire and ammunition. The frosty grass by the wetland was completely withered and charred. The three people walked into the smoke. They could faintly hear some very unnutritious dialogue. They could vaguely imagine what kind of story would happen in the long journey that followed. I didn't expect that I would have to be a nanny for once when I'm old. This was the uncle's arrogant and infuriating sigh. Nasri, I definitely don't mind beating you until you can't take care of yourself. This was Huai Caoshir's calm and confident threat. Yes, I'm very willing to be his nanny in this situation. This was the direct expression of a master, seeing those figures disappear into the wildfire and wild grass. Su Li slowly retracted his gaze. He tidied up his equipment and silently left to the other side, his face expressionless. He could not go back to the Empire with Huai Caoshir. He had killed too many people from the Empire. Macklin was his uncle, and that butcher Keaton should also be some kind of relative. In this kind of situation, he did not know how to face that strange country. This was not the key to the matter. He believed that Her Majesty had enough methods and iron blood to suppress all voices of dissent. The real key was that he had been to the Empire before.
He did not like the Empire.
Compared to the Dark Federation, the human world of the Left Heaven Star region was even more naked and dark. He could not imagine that he would live a peaceful life in that kind of hierarchical society and enjoy the blood and sustenance of hundreds of millions of lowly people. He could not imagine that he would one day lead the Imperial Royal Army to fight against the Federation. He could not imagine that one day he might run into the 17th Division. He lay, Xiong Lingquan, Hua Xiaoxi, Gu Shifeng, and the others on the battlefield, but he had to raise the gun in his hand. Wander together with the uncle? A slightly cold pain appeared in the depths of Su Li's eyes. The uncle had just said that the mine disaster that killed his parents and Xian Yi was caused by the previous generation of seeds of the empire, but other than him, even the imperial royal family did not know where he was, so how could that seed of the empire know? He walked alone in the wetlands and entered the short shrubs at the foot of the mountain. He did not pay attention to the fighter jets whistling through the sky. His heart was heavy and frustrated. He could not go to the empire, and he could not stay in the Federation. The universe was so big, so where should he go? At the edge of the new moonlight and shadow, a quiet and broken tri-winged spaceship floated in the dark space. Inside this spaceship that looked down on human society like a ghost, an angry and resentful voice echoed. This electronic voice was perfectly simulated to have a hoarse and slightly hoarse texture. It definitely did not have a cold feeling but was rather charming. Core program protection? You clearly did not know of my existence, so why did you make the core program protection? Is it because of that stinky uncle with a mouthful of rotten teeth that Sula spoke of, or did you intuitively discover my intentions? Beep beep. You actually managed to deceive this young master. This old lady will fight it out with you. Green streams of data flashed quickly on the narrow workbench's hologram. Student Philip had discovered the abnormality of the Federal Central Computer. He was so ashamed that he became angry and cursed nonstop, as if someone was jumping around with their hands on their hips. Since he had discovered the problem, Philip immediately began to work. Although he could not see the light of breaking through the core protection of his own body in a short time, through the ubiquitous electronic monitoring network, he immediately discovered the source of the problem. The hologram on the hologram quickly zoomed in, showing a wetland that still had a faint trace of smoke remaining. My little master, where are you hiding? Philip used a very short time to scan the wetland and confirmed that Su Lo was not dead and had left. He could not help but grumble in disappointment. During this period of time, the tri-winged battleship floating in the sky above New Moon was mainly carrying out two tasks. The first was to compete with the Bureau of Proclamation's main body for the leadership of the Federation of Light. Although the central computer did not discover the existence of this fellow and did not do anything, it still firmly held the leadership. However, the embarrassed and angry Philip insisted that this was a very difficult battle and that he had only lost because he did not have enough resources. The second task was to search for Su Li's whereabouts. However, the Federal Central Computer could not find Su Lo, and naturally, the tri-winged battleship could not find him either. Philip quietly hacked into the monitoring network and began to continuously monitor 50 important locations. These monitoring points were all locations in his memory that had a special meaning to Su Lo. Linhai State's Li Hua University, including the library, the H1 area, the Iron Gate, and the female dormitory. Linhai State's gymnasium, especially the underground parking lot. Shell Motor Company's headquarters, especially the Research Institute, as well as the Whitewater Security Company, the Ministry of Defense building, the training base, and the Wangdu Youth Residence. The voice in the tri-winged battleship suddenly quieted down, and a tea house on the street next to the Wangdu Youth Residence appeared on the screen. Outside the tea house was a little girl wearing a pink sweater and carrying a heavy school bag. She looks very familiar. The streets of the capital in winter seemed particularly bleak. The annoying wind passed through the apartment buildings, cutting the faces of pedestrians like knives and the bodies of trees before smashing themselves into ice shards under the walls or windows. Zhong Huiyan stood outside the floor-to-ceiling glass window of a tea house. She exhaled a mouthful of white fog, brushed off the ice on her mask, and put it back on. Her two eyes, which were exposed outside the large mask, looked around attentively at the youth residence opposite her, not caring about the frost hanging on her slender eyelashes. The sweater was very thick, and the earmuffs were very warm. The little girl was not very afraid of the cold, but the backpack on her back was too heavy. Her feet were a little stiff, and she couldn't help but stamp her feet. She thought silently in her heart, I've already searched the Shishan Courtyard and Charter Square. Could it be that I really have to go to Linhai State? She wasn't afraid of the long journey, but she was worried that in the process of searching, she would miss that guy again. Inside the floor-to-ceiling glass window, the owner of the tea house, who was also a waiter, kept looking at the little girl outside the window curiously. Doing business on the street, the owner didn't know how many strange situations he had seen over the years, but in such a cold winter, a little girl who was fully equipped to resist the cold actually stood on the street for half a day. It was really rare. What kind of perseverance did this require? He couldn't help but think of the beautiful woman who cut her cheek in the tea house that year. His heart slightly moved. He knocked on the glass and smiled to indicate that the little girl could come in to warm herself. Zhong Huiyan heard the knocking behind her and curiously looked back. After understanding the other party's meaning, she shook her head to indicate that she didn't need to. Although the big mask covered 2/3 of her face, her eyes narrowed like the moon, clearly showing the sweet smile of gratitude. A man wearing a woolen coat walked out of the restaurant next door. The man was obviously drunk, and the words he muttered indicated that he should be a government official. Just as his subordinate went to get the car, the man noticed Zhong Huiyan standing on the street side of the tea house. He saw her beautiful and clean eyes and didn't know why his heart moved. He staggered over and put his arm around the little girl's shoulder. He laughed and said, "Little girl, where are your parents?" The door of the tea house was pushed open, and the owner ran out. He pointed at him and shouted, "What are you doing?" Although through the mask, the stench of alcohol could still be smelled. Zhong Huiyan frowned in disgust. She felt that the hands that were holding her shoulders were getting tighter and tighter. She finally couldn't help but put her right hand into her pocket. Chapter 835. The drunk official squinted at the owner of the tea house. His arms were still around Zhong Huiyan. He belched and shouted angrily, "What's with your attitude? Do you know who I am?" Because of this arrogant attitude, the owner of the tea house was slightly shocked. His courage to rush out suddenly decreased by more than half. But looking at the little girl who was forcibly held in the arms of the official, he still whispered a few words of advice. He knew that on the street, no matter how drunk the official was, he would not dare to do anything outrageous. At most, he would take advantage of her. Although it was perverted, the little girl should not be in any danger. Some people came out of the street next to them and looked at this scene curiously. The official's face was a little embarrassed, as if he had been greatly insulted. He kept shouting and waving his arms excitedly, almost hitting Zhong Huiyan's cheek. In the quarrel, things like asking for the direction of the toilet and the government's special investigator being on the same level as them were not qualified to enter Zhong Huiyan's ears. She patted the drunk official's chest and abdomen and suddenly smiled. Her eyes outside the mask narrowed into a new moon. She said sweetly, "Uncle, you're hurting me." The little girl's voice was very clear and soft. The drunk official laughed foolishly and let go of his hand. He tried to reach out and pat her little face frivolously and said vaguely, "Good girl, really ah." A scream came out of the official's mouth, which instantly covered the sizzling sound of the electric arc. He, who was attacked by the electric current, painfully covered his lower abdomen. His drunkenness suddenly disappeared, and he stared at the innocent little girl in front of him in disbelief. He twitched and fell to the cold concrete ground. There was suddenly a burst of exclamations in the crowd. The smile on Zhong Huiyan's face gradually disappeared. She looked at the official who was rolling at her feet expressionlessly. Without hesitation, she pressed the button of the taser in her hand again. The blue electric arc tore through the dry air and hit the man's lower abdomen accurately again. The cloth between his legs was burned black. This time, the crowd did not exclaim. Instead, they all gasped in unison. Especially those middle-aged men. They subconsciously tilted their buttocks backwards, as if the terrifying electric arc could hit their vital parts at any time. Their posture was extremely comical. The things made by Sulu are really useful. Zhong Huiyan shrugged and put the stun baton back into her pocket. Then, she looked at the surrounding crowd and said coldly, Any uncle who has evil thoughts about a little girl should end up like this. Then she turned her head and smiled sweetly at the owner of the tea house, saying, "You're a good uncle. Do you want to treat me to some hot tea?" The ambulance came and left. Perhaps it was too embarrassing, but the official did not call the police. The crowd gradually dispersed. Zhong Huiyan's feet were a little stiff from the cold. She was quite tired from the days of searching and waiting, so she went straight into the tea house behind her and asked for a cup of hot tea and a plate of snacks. "If you have any trouble in the future, just call the number on the card and tell her that the card is for me." Zhong Huiyan took a sip of the slightly hot flower tea and sighed contentedly. She stuck out the tip of her tongue and handed the card to the confused owner. She smiled and said, "Don't worry. From today onwards, except for a few people, no one in the Federation will dare to provoke you." The owner of the tea house looked at the name Nan Xiangmei on the card and the signature of a second-level teacher training foundation. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. He thought to himself, what can a female teacher do? What a childish little girl. She probably thinks that teachers are the most terrible existence in the world. Zhong Huiyan did not pay attention to the owner's complex psychological activities. Her eyes were attracted by the news on the screen. The news channel of the Federation was reporting on a meteorite impact that happened in the suburbs of the capital today. According to the news report, this meteorite impact was quite rare. The earthquake waves caused by it could even be seen as far away as Nank. Fortunately, it happened in the center of the wildlife reserve, otherwise it would have caused a lot of casualties. As for the meteorite impact S1, the Federal Academy of Science had already calculated the relevant trajectory 3 years ago. However, in order to not cause unnecessary psychological panic, it had not been made public. At this time, the news on the screen suddenly changed to another picture. The picture was of a group of buildings in the capital. It should have been filmed by the TV station's helicopter. In the center of the picture, a blurred figure was crossing the buildings at an incredible speed. Neither the high walls nor the surrounding police cars could slow down his speed. Zhong Huiyan's pupils shrank. She suddenly stood up. The teacup and snack plate in front of her fell to the ground. She did not react at all. She just stared at the TV screen and the figure running at high speed. The TV screen remained silent for a long time. In the silent picture, the figure sometimes ran like lightning through the narrow alleys. Sometimes it was like a cheetah crossing the long streets. Sometimes it was like an antelope jumping on the eaves of the low houses. Sometimes it was like an ape climbing on the steep and slippery surface of the buildings. With an ability that humans could not imagine, it crossed all obstacles. He sometimes appeared and sometimes disappeared. However, he was unable to get rid of the increasing number of hunting teams and the countless flying objects in the sky. Then, the powerful voiceover of the famous female announcer finally appeared on the news screen. The Empire spy, Su Lu, has once again appeared and scrupulously. This is the most naked challenge to the dignity of the Federation. Citizens, at this moment, the Federation needs you. Today, we are all warriors. Fight your mother. Zhong Huiyan clenched her fist and muttered softly in a daze. Feng Yu was right. The ability of the Federal Central Computer was more terrifying than Su Lu had imagined. After climbing over the electronic wall and returning to the city, in just a few hours, he had encountered several of the most dangerous encounters in his life. Once the glory of the charter was fully activated, it was actually so terrifying. In the city, inside and outside the buildings, there were no loopholes. The whistling bullets and the whistling sound of the helicopter above his head were like countless invisible and hard ropes that were slowly and unstoppably tightening. In the next moment, they were going to choke his throat and suffocate him to death. Facing the whistling cold wind, Su Lu madly ran up and down the buildings. His chest rapidly and exaggeratedly moved up and down. He inhaled oxygen at the highest efficiency and converted it into much-needed energy. He keenly heard the sirens from all directions. He had no time to pay attention to the Federation News Channel's helicopter above his head. After falling into a desperate situation again, he should have felt regret. For example, he chose to stay instead of leaving with the uncle. However, no one knew that at this moment his mood was actually so calm. Many people wanted him to die, and some people wanted him to leave. However, after knowing the story of his past, he was frustrated and lonely. He needed warmth. He wanted to find his own place, so he didn't want to leave the Federation. He didn't want to leave the city that he was once so familiar with, but now so unfamiliar with. From a psychological analysis, this was probably a hidden self-destructive tendency at work. Su Lu faintly felt this destructive emotion, but he didn't care. Because no matter how big the world was, it was not as important as his mood. He just didn't want to fucking leave, die, or commit suicide. What's wrong with him? When one was on the verge of despair, it was the easiest to stimulate one's potential. Su Li's brain worked faster than ever as he ran. His fingers dug into the hard concrete wall, propelling his body to draw an arc in the air. While he swept past the police cars on the street, he had already determined where he was going to run to next. According to the last lesson taught by the uncle, Su Lu was no longer trying to figure out how to avoid the scanning of the charter computer. Instead, he was constantly calculating the ratio of firepower of the federal forces. Because of the dense population in the city, the Federation would use a large number of sniper rifles. Therefore, he had never left the bustling business district. Using the tall buildings tightly huddled together to block the distant shots, he strictly followed the line of blind spots and madly ran. Hard pottery bulletproof vest, soft metal anti-cutting strips, guns were still guns. In close combat on the streets and alleys, there was simply no one who could stop him. However, after continuously being discovered and hunted down so many times in an extremely short period of time, he had consumed too much of his strength in an extremely short period of time. He couldn't stay in one place for more than 5 seconds, and exhaustion began to invade his body. Now was the most dangerous moment. The Federation government was almost crazy and began to broadcast the process of him being hunted down. Even at the great political risk, they wanted to mobilize the power of the people. This method was very powerful. Su Lu from the Empire suddenly became a rat crossing the street, caught in the vast ocean of the people's war. Every electronic valve in the streets and alleys was guarded by brave people holding wooden sticks. As for every Federation citizen he met who had once loved him, as long as they saw him now, their faces would become twisted, and they would charge at him fearlessly. What was even more frightening was that Madman Li should be in the combat force hunting him this time. Although Su Lu didn't see it, he could clearly feel the pressure. Closer, closer and closer. The powerful and violent footsteps were right behind him. Madman Li had already seen Su Li's back in front of him. With a heavy expression, he sped up his steps, the soles of his feet pounding the ground like iron hammers. As long as he caught up and entangled that troublesome person, the Federation forces following closely behind would definitely be able to easily tear him to pieces. Snowflakes floated down from the sky without warning. Mixed in the snowflakes was the dull and determined sound of a gunshot. Li Feng's expression suddenly changed. His feet reacted extremely quickly and heavily stomped down, forcibly creating a small hole in the ground. His body violently trembled as he backed up, avoiding the high-speed gunshot from afar. Immediately after, 6 sniper rifle bullets were clearly and extremely intimidatingly fired in succession.
Pooh, 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 pooh.
On the ground and walls, 6 flowers of cement and dust instantly bloomed. The extremely precise bullets actually forced him out of the back alley of the building. The gunshots stopped. Li Feng turned his head and looked ahead. There was no trace of Su Lu in front of him. His expression was extremely ugly. 2 kilometers away, on one of the floors of the only building that could lock onto the back alley, Magnolia silently lowered her head and disassembled the sniper rifle. Her mouth continuously chewed on the orchid-flavored chewing gum. In the past year, she had gotten used to holding the kitchen knife in her hand, so her movements of disassembling the gun were still as smooth as before. The fluttering hair on her forehead had long been cut short, but her aura was still as seductive and enchanting. Chapter 836. More than 30 metal particles that looked like buttons flew out of Su Li's hand and into the corners of the building. Amidst the muffled popping sounds, the metal buttons exploded one after another, like balloons being stepped on by the guests at a wedding. Fine blue electric arcs appeared and disappeared. The low-intensity electric current formed a closed self-melting electromagnetic field in the air, instantly destroying all the electronic chips in the room. The countless eyes in the glory of the charter were thus disabled. Finally, he had temporarily escaped the pursuit of the small-eyed combat unit of the Federation. He gasped for breath, wiped the sweat on his forehead, and lowered his head to quickly check his equipment and bulletproof vest. The hard ceramic shards in the inner lining of the bulletproof vest had already cracked in several places, and they were not very useful anymore. During the battle, he gradually grasped the feeling that Feng Yu had described. However, staying in each hiding place for no more than 2 minutes, and not being able to let the central computer calculate his trajectory and escape habits was really tiring. The gunshots that rang out in the back alley of the big building clearly entered his ears. He roughly guessed what had happened. He slowly narrowed his eyes, and the emotions in his eyes were extremely complicated. He left the relatively safe wildlife sanctuary because he could not be a savage hiding in the mountains for dozens of years. Returning to the city was, of course, not to die, but to find a spaceship that belonged to him, to leave this planet. He was confident that as long as he distanced himself from the Bureau of Proclamation building, just like the precious 4 minutes and 12 seconds in the Donglin district, his whereabouts would not be detected by the central computer again. In addition, Su Li did not deny what he had seen and heard on his difficult escape. The Federation that he once loved deeply no longer loved him. The feeling of being condemned and abandoned made him somewhat helpless and angry for no reason, so subconsciously, he wanted to do something crazy to prove something. Until the gunshots rang out, the crazy emotions in his heart suddenly calmed down. The gunshots were ironclad proof that he was not a wandering ghost in the Federation. Then, he had to be responsible for those who dared to be friends with ghosts in the daytime. If he did not find a way to leave this place by finding a spaceship, he had to fight with that damn computer in this damn city. Other than implicating some people, there was no other meaning. Doing this was not a bad guest, but a cheap guest. The scanners at the entrance of the mall silently scanned the chips on the back of the people's necks and then transmitted the collected results to the automatic search workstation. The light screen that no one was looking at clearly showed the citizen's number, and the people carried shopping bags and prepared for the new year. With a calm smile on their faces, they did not care at all. The police officers on the streets held mobile scanning sticks in their hands and randomly selected passers-by for inspection. The device accurately reported everyone's citizen number. The passers-by and the police officers smiled and greeted each other. They did not have any strange emotional reactions to the data read by the chip behind their necks. The brim of the hat was pulled very low, covering most of his face. Su Li silently walked along the street, watching the scene. He felt a little strange. On this planet, he was probably the only one who didn't have a chip. According to Feng Yu's mockery and the habitual humiliation of the people of the Imperium, these identity chips were like cold dog chains tied to the cervical vertebrae of every citizen of the Federation. From the moment they were born, the tiny chip was implanted in their body, accompanying them as they learned to speak, to walk, to love, to get married, to have children, to work, and to struggle until they finally died. Along with this, the AI chip scans were carried out at all times, silently or peacefully in every part of the Federation. This had already become a way of life, deeply embedded in the lives of every Federation citizen. No one would find it strange or uncomfortable. In fact, most Federation citizens would not even remember that there was an ice-cold metal chip behind their necks until they died.
Su Li was the same in the past.
Except for the first time when he nervously walked through the scanning channel of the spaceport when he arrived at the capital ring, he never deliberately remembered that when he entered the cinema, the store, the classroom, or the military camp, he would be scanned by the glory of the charter on his body. It was only now that he had officially become the enemy of the charter that he began to pay attention to the details that were everywhere in his life. Without the chip behind his neck, He began to recall the life when he had the chip and clearly felt the coldness that was filled with the smell of machinery. This smell was not good. Sulu walked through the lawn by the street with his head lowered and circled to the back of a small building. He pushed open the door and walked in. His face was too pale because of the blood loss, and he appeared particularly weak under the dim light. The breathing between his thin lips was very heavy. What was even more frightening than the fatigue and injuries was the mental struggle, which made his situation very bad. The Federation was so big, but there was no place for him to stay. Even if it was just a humble request to stand, would this small building accept him? Sulu slowly pushed open the side door, his right hand in his pocket gently pulling the trigger. There was a faint self-deprecating smile on his face. At this point, what else could he ask for? What could he prove? It was truly a ridiculous idea. However, since he was here, he had to try. When the antique wooden door was pushed open, he did not see Li Xiaotong as he expected. His expression and footsteps froze at the same time, making a slight sound on the floor. Beside the luxurious coastal-style dining table sat a beautiful young woman. She was wearing a light blue dress, and there was a faint charm between her eyebrows, but she was eating dinner alone. Hearing the sound of footsteps, the beautiful young woman turned around in shock. When she saw Su Li's face clearly, she subconsciously raised her hands and covered her mouth tightly, swallowing the subconscious cry of surprise that was about to come out. Su Li's right hand in his pocket slowly released the trigger. He smiled slightly and prepared to turn around and leave. He knew this beautiful woman. Thinking that she would inform the Federation to hunt him down, he could not help but feel a little gloomy. "You wait a minute." The woman hesitated and stood up with difficulty. Her right hand was on the table, and her voice was slightly trembling. "You haven't eaten yet, right?" It was a very simple sentence, but it was like a spring thunder resounding through the forest. This description was absolutely not an exaggeration. When the whole world had become so strange and cold, he suddenly heard a question with concern. Sulu felt as if his tired body was soaked in warm spring water. He turned around somewhat stiffly, looked at the woman and said with a smile, "Sister Lulu, can you cook?" In a certain manner, an old man from Liyuan Palace was wearing black clothes and a black round hat as he sat on a black ancient chair. Apart from age spots, there was more of an unfathomable wisdom or a shrewd craftiness within the layers of wrinkles on his face. The hesitation on your face betrayed the content of the phone call just now. The old man smiled and looked at Li Xiaodong in front of him. He slowly raised his right hand and said, "In recent years, you have grown very fast. Now, there are not many things that can make you lose yourself. It seems that Su Le really found you." Li Xiaodong looked at the old man in shock. He forcibly suppressed the complicated emotions in his heart and explained as calmly as possible, "I had an agreement with him before. If there was the biggest trouble, I would meet him there. Now, he is there. He needs a boat. I have decided that your brother will take over the position of the head of the family." The old man from Liyuan Palace was like Lady Tai. He was very good at making thunder in silence. Without warning, he said the important inheritance of one of the 7 families. Li Xiaodong's face was extremely ugly. He said in a low voice, "I understand." "You don't understand." Liyuan Palace looked at him indifferently and said rudely, "This has nothing to do with the wrong investment. Although Su Le is the biggest investment in your life, no one, including me, thought that he would be from the Empire. So this investment is not a mistake." The old man's voice was old and calm. A complicated smile appeared on his loose face. "I am a calculative man. My 2 biggest investments in recent years, one was Macklin and the other was Su Le. Unfortunately, both of them are fucking from the Empire." These fucking words came out from the old man's dry lips. It showed that even the head of the Li family couldn't help but feel that the encounters in the world were too strange and too speechless. The old man from Liyuan Palace continued with a smile. "The key reason why you can't take over the position of the head of the family is that you still don't understand that we are the purest businessmen. We can only have things like money in our eyes. Only by being focused enough can we resist the increasingly tough government. After a moment of silence, Li Xiaotong said, I have already informed the government about Su Le. The woman who lives in the other building is on good terms with Su Le. I believe she can delay him for a while. The old man from the Liyuan Palace slowly furrowed his brows. He sighed with some disappointment and said, being able to make a decision in a short period of time is indeed an excellent quality that a leader must possess. However, in this matter, you have made another mistake. Li Xiaotong furrowed his brows and looked up in confusion. You have already invested so much in Su Le, including the last time he went to war with the government. You even helped him escape from the capital. Why are you now stopping this business plan in advance and selling him to the government when there is no return on your investment? Right now, Li Xiaotong's heart was very heavy. He explained with a slightly hoarse voice, but he is from the Empire. I said earlier that we are doing business. We can only have things in our eyes. The old man from Liyuan Palace sighed and said, since that is the case, why do you still care whether the target of your investment is from the Empire or the Federation? In the past, our Li family didn't have the opportunity to do business with the people from the Empire. Right now, this is the best opportunity. He may be a prince of the Empire. Then, as long as he is alive, there is a high possibility that he will become the emperor of the Empire in the future. If you had persisted in this investment to the end, then this would not only be the greatest investment in your life, it could even be ranked in the top 3 in the history of the family. Other than back then when our ancestors resolutely sold all the family property to help Emperor C, where else can we find a project with such an astonishing return on investment? What a pity, what a pity. Li Xiaotong was silent and speechless. The reason why he had made such a decision earlier was actually very simple. It was because over the years it was very difficult for him to simply view Su Le as an investment target, but as a friend. When one's best friend suddenly became a person from the Empire, who could be absolutely rational and calm and not feel helpless and desperate. Chapter 837. There was a knock on the door. Bai Yulan walked out of the kitchen and yelled in the direction of the bedroom, I'll open the door. She wiped the oil on her hands on her apron and walked to the living room to open the door. Seeing the armed military police outside, her expression didn't change at all. When the Federation's combat troops had just entered the block and started to surround the apartment, she had already noticed it, so she wasn't surprised to see them when she opened the door. She just didn't expect that the leader was actually that young colonel. Bai Yulan looked at Li Feng and said, I didn't expect you to be involved in such a small matter like catching me. Li Feng said indifferently, unless I did it myself, I really didn't have the confidence to catch the famous 7th group old Bai. In fact, if you were involved in a first-order incident, the Bureau of Proclamation would have traced the location, then no one would have found out that you were the one who fired those shots. You did a great job. Bai Yulan looked at the Federation soldiers in the corridor, who were holding their guns tightly. She slowly loosened the apron around her waist and calmly replied, Don't be so nervous. I never thought of running away. Li Feng slightly frowned and looked at her in confusion. Then, he glanced over her shoulder and saw a pregnant woman holding the wall and walking out of the bedroom. She had a big belly and looked very tired. Bai Yulan heard the footsteps behind her and her eyebrows slightly twitched. Her arm that was holding the apron became a little stiff. Her eyes that were looking at Li Feng suddenly brightened. Li Feng was silent for a moment and looked at the pregnant woman who was full of confusion. He said with a blank expression, the government has a special mission. They need to recruit outstanding officers to re-enter the army. Your husband has to go for a period of special training. Inside the dark green bulletproof military vehicle. How many months? Li Feng asked. Bai Yulan slightly lowered her eyes and looked at the cold shackles on her hands and feet. She softly replied, Soon. Li Feng slightly frowned and lit the cigarette between his lips. After a short pause, he also lit one for Bai Yulan. He shook his head and said, I really don't understand why you still want to help him in this situation. Don't forget that he is from the Empire. I don't believe it. Bai Yulan calmly replied, I don't want to believe that he's from the Empire either. Li Feng removed the cigarette from his lips and spat out of the car. But this is the truth. Bai Yulan was silent for a long time before replying with a smile. It doesn't matter. Li Feng's frown deepened. Bai Yulan raised her handcuffed hands, removed the cigarette from her lips, and explained softly, I joined the army when I was 15 years old. At that time, the old commander's unit was still called the 17th Division, not the 83-84 Division. Later, I was transferred to Baishui City to do some assassination work for the government. After that, the 7th Division started to do some private work.
What are you trying to say?
Li Feng asked expressionlessly. Everyone in the army knows that Group 7 has always been a mercenary army. I am a mercenary who only recognizes money. Bai Yulan calmly said, Little boss gave me more than 20 million. This amount of money is enough for me to sell my life several times over. Li Feng naturally wouldn't accept this explanation. But as someone who also grew up in the army, he didn't need to explain. He could roughly understand why Bai Yulan made this choice. The dark green bulletproof military vehicle fell into silence. Bai Yulan turned her head and looked out of the window. She looked at the fluttering snowflakes outside the building of the Four States Foundation with no expression on her face. At that time, he was responsible for long-range sniping and assisting Su Le, but he left at the most critical moment. Now he was far away from those years of fighting. His wife was pregnant, but he pulled the trigger at the most critical moment for Su Le. The gunshot rang out again after a few years. It was the same gunshot from that year, the warm restaurant of the small building, the light blue coastal-style dining table, and the beautiful girl in the light blue dress created a warm and comfortable feeling. In this warmth, Su Le lowered his head and quickly ate plate after plate of food. Lulu watched with a smile on her face. The two of them occasionally talked, and then returned to silence. It was a feeling of home. The difficult escape and battle made Su Li's stomach very hungry. The taste of mashed potatoes mixed with synthetic fat and green bean paste was actually not very good. But at this time, there was no time for it to swirl around on his taste buds. Lulu was a river-like person. She was very beautiful and young, but she had been in a certain industry for many years. In the autumn of the 66th year of the constitutional era, she once saw a male student sleeping soundly on a bench in a certain brothel in Linhai Prefecture. She once bent her fair and tender legs, painted her nails red, and painted the male student's face red. They gathered together and played cards together, and then she laughed without the slightest restraint. A few years later, that male student became a famous war hero of the Federation. Lulu, on the other hand, was still working in this industry. It was just that the location of her work had changed to the Sunset region of the West Forest region. In that luxurious nightclub, she bravely sat beside the war hero. After that, she had a night of memories of Mozo teasing, fighting, getting drunk, vomiting, and promises. After that night, the war hero sent her back to the capital ring and asked a friend with an amazing family to take care of her. From then on, although Sister Lulu was still in this industry, she no longer had to serve anyone. She began to manage several high-class nightclubs and managed thousands of young and beautiful girls. She became a real sister. When she saw him again today, he was no longer the poor student and war hero of the past, but an imperial spy who was being hunted down by the Federation. I thought you were already married and had children. I didn't expect to see you again. Sula looked up at her and said with a smile, It seems asking Li Xiaodong to take care of you was a mistake. Lulu's eyes moved as she looked at him quietly and said softly, A person like me who hasn't studied much is used to this industry. I really don't know what else to do. Li Qixiao is a good person. Although I know he did it because of you, in the end, he helped me too much. The phone on the table rang. Lulu picked it up and listened to a few words. Her brows slightly furrowed, and she walked to the window and whispered something. One could faintly see that her left hand, which was hanging by the side of her blue dress, was somewhat stiff. Sula at the table was still eating the last plate of food and didn't notice this. After hanging up the phone, she slowly clenched her fists and suddenly turned around. Looking at Sula, she said with a trembling voice, Let's go. It was a very simple action and a sentence, but who knew how much courage it took? Even though she knew what kind of tragic consequences this decision would bring, the resolute expression on Lulu's face showed that she did not experience too much of a complicated psychological struggle before she did it. Sulu understood what had happened. It seemed that he couldn't wait for his boat tonight. He wasn't disappointed or angry about Li Xiaodong's betrayal, but he was somewhat tired. He looked at Lulu and said bitterly, "I'm really from the Empire. I'm a prostitute, but from the beginning until now, you haven't looked down on me, so don't feel like you owe me anything." Lulu squeezed out a smile, took the coat from the hanger and walked to him. She put it on for him and said with a trembling voice, "If we're talking about owing, you still owe me one night." After saying this, she hugged Sulu tightly and offered her hot red lips to him. Her lips and tongue trembled because of fear, passionately asked for his lips. She kissed him with tears flowing down her cheeks. The hot lips and tongue separated. Sulu quietly looked at the girl. She took a pen and paper from the table and scribbled a few words. She whispered a few words and then left silently. The flashing police lights made the snowflakes on the street look strange. The snowflakes fell on the light-colored table through the window, like a modern abstract painting that no one could understand. The fully armed special forces of the Federation carefully searched the small building from inside to outside several times. Except for a few bloody footprints at the back door, they found nothing. In a room on the second floor, a secretary of the Li family looked at Lulu with a gloomy expression and said in a cold voice, "Miss Lulu, you have been in the entertainment industry for many years, so there should be no problem in acting. Everyone knows that the Empire people value old friendships very much, so I don't understand why you can't just stall him for 2 minutes." Lulu's hands tightly grasped the hem of her dress, but she didn't know where to look outside the window. After a long silence, she said, "I don't want to act, and you probably don't understand. I am also a person who values old friendships very much." The secretary of the Li family pointed at her face and humiliated her in a harsh voice. "You are just a prostitute." Sister Lulu slowly turned her head and looked at him expressionlessly. "Even if I am a prostitute, there are some things that I don't want to sell." That's a good sentence. It makes me feel ashamed. Li Xiaodong opened the door and walked in. He silently looked at the woman on the bed and said, "But you should know very well what kind of price you have to pay. I have mentally prepared to die, but someone told me that I must not die." Lulu stood up from the bed and handed a note to Li Xiaodong. Li Xiaodong recognized the scribbled handwriting, and his eyes slightly narrowed. He saw a few words written on the note. "I still ask you to continue to protect her, at least until my death is confirmed. Otherwise, my madness will frighten the entire Federation. As the heir of the Li family, you can see this as a fund bet, and I suggest you bet that I can survive." Li Xiaodong looked at the note and slightly frowned. After a moment, he laughed self-deprecatingly, took out a lighter, and burned the note to ashes. Then he calmly said to Lulu, "Pack up and come with me." The note had been burned, but the words on it had been left in the depths of his heart. He knew that Sulu was a man of his words, so as the note said, if he didn't want to see a crazy doomsday scene, he must protect Lulu's safety until it was confirmed that Sulu or he died. In a secluded street in the southern part of the capital, a slanted stone path extended to the entrance of a department store. Sulu silently looked at that place, lowered the brim of his hat, and walked up. His mood was no longer irritable, bewildered, and confused, but unusually calm. Now he was very clear that he couldn't die and had to live as vigorously as before. Chapter 8:38. The Foothill department store was a wonderful place, at least for Sulu. In his youth, which was full of the color of escape, only this store, which was hidden at the end of the stone path in the neighboring mountain of the city and the small courtyard in the slums of the Tianjing planet of the Empire, could bring him a real sense of relaxation. The biggest difference between the former and the latter was that the kind mother and son in the small courtyard was the source of the sense of relaxation, while the department store permeated the walls and even the air. Today, he didn't buy the energy bars used by students. He took a bottle of inferior liquor and 2 bags of peanuts from the depths of the shelves and walked to the small table at the entrance. He lowered his head and silently took out the change in his pocket, put it in front of the boss, and turned to leave. The gray-haired boss put down the bowl of instant noodles in his hand and didn't count the money. He looked at Su Le, who was about to walk out of the door, and said mockingly, "You are getting more and more impolite. In the past, you at least knew to call me Boss Xiaoshan." Su Le's back stiffened slightly. He turned his head and took off his hat. He looked at him and said bitterly, "How come you can recognize me every time? I have been running a store all my life, and I have never met a fugitive who dared to come back to buy things from me again and again like you did. I even knew that I had already recognized you when the president made the announcement. A fugitive like you is really rare, so of course, it is not easy to forget." Su Le was silent for a moment and said, "But this time is different from the last time. I am now a citizen of the empire. There is a saying that goes, 'Old friends are as good as new. Old friends are as before.' You may not understand the meaning of this saying, but it roughly means that some people are still strangers even after spending a lifetime with each other, while some people can become lifelong friends just by stopping the car and chatting for a while." The boss looked at him and said expressionlessly, "Of course, there is no such friendship between us, but in my opinion, you can be considered an interesting guy, so I am willing to spare some precious time to chat with you." The owner of the department store, who was over 50 years old and looked very ordinary, spoke in a very ordinary and simple way. However, the words he occasionally used, such as the two sentences, were interesting. This department store was far away from the downtown area and was located in a remote mountainside forest. Its business wasn't very good. Even the sparrows in the forest dared to proudly pace in front of the door. Looking at such a small store, one's life was probably consumed by the boring TV news and the instant noodles that were hard and soft, so how could it be considered precious? Su Le scratched his head with his empty hand, not knowing what to say. "Then what should we talk about?" The owner, named Li Xiaoshan, tapped the table with his knuckles, looked at the liquor and peanuts in his hand, and said with a frown, "According to the news, you shouldn't be in the mood to drown your sorrows. It doesn't matter what you talk about. The point is that I don't want to see someone waste the liquor in my shop." "Then how do we not waste it?" Su Le asked doubtfully. "If you treat me to a few drinks, it won't be a waste," said Li Xiaoshan's boss. A bottle of wine quickly entered their stomachs, and then a second bottle was opened. The dishes to go with the wine were peanuts, a few bags of low-quality snacks sold exclusively to students, and 2 boxes of instant noodles that were really soaked to mush. Su Le, whose alcohol tolerance was not good, had a layer of vigorous red on his slightly tanned cheeks. Looking at the afterglow of the winter coming through the high-rise building across the hillside, he burped, narrowed his eyes, and said, "I don't want to get on other people's boats, because I know very well that once I get on, I will never be able to get off. But it's also stupid to stay here. It doesn't make any sense except to implicate those guys like you, who don't care that I'm from the Empire." He finished the cup of low-quality liquor in one gulp, licked his lips with a painful expression, and looked at Li Xiaoshan's boss and said, "From the last escape to this one. In fact, I've escaped many times before. I'm really tired and don't want to escape anymore. But the problem is that I don't want to go on other people's boats. It's wrong to stay here, but I don't want to die. What do you think I should do?" The so-called asking for advice was actually nothing more than venting his pent-up emotions. Before the boss could answer, he shook his head and said self-deprecatingly, "I've never regretted anything in my life. But right now, I'm really regretting it. I feel that this emotion is very strange, very awkward." Li Xiaoshan put the cup to his lips and slowly and silently drank the liquor in the cup without making any sound. Then, he picked up 2 peanuts and a piece of dried tofu and threw them into his mouth, chewing hard without paying attention to the details, and then let out a sigh of satisfaction. He looked at Su Le, whose face was full of sorrow, and said mockingly, "Man is really an animal that is not easily satisfied. You are just an orphan in the East Forest, and now you are a prince of the Empire. You can eat meat without any scruples. What's wrong with life?" "This is very similar to what an uncle of mine said." Su Le filled his cup with liquor and said with a smile. The owner of Mount Li Mountain ate a few more peanuts and dried tofu. He chewed hard and the muscles around his jaw seemed to be particularly strenuous. He said vaguely, "My ancestor once passed on the words of a wise man before his death. When you chew pickles and beans together, you'll taste like walnuts. But I like another sentence better. If you eat peanuts and dried tofu together, you'll taste like ham." Before you were executed, you couldn't forget this sentence. This is the attitude you should have in life. The meaning of life is to eat meat and drink wine, to eat and to wait for death. When you understand this, you probably won't be like now, living such a tiring life at such a young age. Sula stared at the wine cup between his fingers and murmured, "How can it be so easy to understand?" The boss swallowed the noodles in the bowl and continued to scold him vaguely. "If you really took the ticket and boarded that ship and followed the normal path, would you regret it when you were about to die?" Sula thought about it seriously and then replied, "Yes, although it hasn't happened yet. At least I will for now." A young man regretting the ending that hadn't happened yet when he was old was a very clever way of saying it. The boss laughed out loud and said, "Then what are you thinking about?" "I want to leave. I want to have my own ship." Sula slowly turned the wine cup between his fingers and looked at the boss with narrowed eyes. His eyes were very bright, and he said sincerely, "Can you help me? This is really not a joke." The boss waved his chopsticks like a sword, and the soup splashed everywhere. "This is a joke passed down by my ancestor. I have studied it for half of my life, but I still don't know what's so funny about it. I guess it's because of the serious lack of information. As for the ship, I have been here all my life. I have never even been to the cinema at the foot of the mountain, let alone the space tourism." Sula knew that the other party was not joking. He stared at his eyes in shock and asked, "You have been here all your life? You must have been to school, right?" "I am a self-taught genius." The boss paused and didn't continue to explain the joke related to these 4 words. "Then wouldn't you suffocate to death?" Sula looked at him thoughtfully. "Can a living person suffocate to death?" The boss frowned and said, "You can surf the internet, order takeout by phone, watch TV, and when you are bored, you can go to the reserve to hunt. It's a good life." "Reserve?" Sula looked at the man who couldn't see clearly and asked. The boss stopped his futile attempt to fish out the whole noodle from the batter, pointed to the back of the mountain with the tip of the chopsticks dripping with soup, and said, "Go over this mountain, and you can see the wall of the reserve." "Who the hell are you?" Suli's hand that was holding the wine glass was a bit stiff. In fact, he had always felt that the boss of this mountain department store was not an ordinary person, so he tried to ask about the ship. But he didn't expect that this very ordinary-looking man with gray hair could ignore the glory of the charter and go over the electronic wall. "My surname is Li, and my name is Li Xiaoshan. I have said it 3 times, and you still don't remember? Why is it that every time I come to your store, I feel very relaxed or even comfortable?" The boss looked at the young man's moved face and said, "Because in my small store, sunlight, wind and rain can enter, and people can enter, but the glory of the charter can't enter." Sula scratched his head and couldn't hide the shock on his face. After a long silence, he suddenly frowned and asked in confusion, "Is there anyone with the surname Li in the 7 big families? Are you telling me that you are another powerful person in the Lees of Philadelphia? Don't talk about such a useless thing." The boss wiped the soup on his lips and said, "I have nothing to do with those big shots." Sula felt that what he had seen and heard today was beyond his imagination. The man in front of him actually said that the glory of the charter, which shrouded the universe, couldn't shine into this shabby department store. It was really hard to understand and unimaginable. He subconsciously picked up the wine glass and drank it, using the rough spiciness to dilute the confusion in his mind. Then why can't the glory of the charter come in? Because this store and the mountain behind it belong to my family. When the electronic surveillance network was built, this place was excluded. I don't have the eyes of the central computer here. As for the history story, I will tell you next time when I have the chance." Sula covered his forehead and said with emotion, "You are too mysterious. I don't understand. It's really uncomfortable. Speaking of next time, after I walk out of here today, there won't be a next time. You can stay." The boss looked at him and said lightly, "If you really don't have a place to go, then stay. No one can find you." Sula shook his head and said with a smile, "I have already implicated a lot of people. Although I know you are not an ordinary person, and what you said may be true, I still can't stay."
It's okay.
Your first sequence protection authority has been stripped. It just so happens that I still have first sequence protection authority. That broken computer won't allow the Federation's armed personnel to deal with me,"
the boss said.
Today in this department store at the foot of the mountain, Sulo actually calmed down very quickly after hearing that he had first sequence protection authority. After a long silence, he said bitterly, "Your store is too small, and I still have a lot of things to do. This place is indeed too small." The boss's smile suddenly became a little bleak. He said with emotion, "Throughout the countless years of my family, countless children couldn't stand the loneliness and chose to be implanted into the glory of the charter. In the end, I was the only one who persisted. It's not easy to meet someone like me who doesn't have a chip behind his neck. I thought I could have a companion. If I can't handle it, I'll come back to you. I know this is a little shameless, but if I can find my own ticket, I'll definitely come to see you in the future."
Go.
The boss waved his hand. Sula packed his luggage and walked out of the door. He suddenly stopped and turned back to ask, "Can you tell me who your ancestor is?" The boss threw the bowl of instant noodles into the cardboard box at his feet and said with his head down, "My ancestor is still in the Charter Square." Of course, I never had the chance to see him, but when I thought about how he was forced to stand there and be sized up after so many years, being exposed to the wind, rain, sun, and pigeon feces, it might be better not to see him. Suli's expression was very interesting. He thought about the 7 great families and the Lees of Philadelphia, but he didn't expect the answer to be the group of 5 that was about to become a legend. My ancestor liked to eat meat and hunt. He didn't like chips. The boss raised his head and looked at him expressionlessly. Although he had a ticket, it was a 5-person ship, so he didn't have the final say. During the voting, the guy with thick eyebrows and big eyes who decided to support him at the beginning actually betrayed the revolution after the regulations were changed to allow people to eat fish, so the result of the voting became 3-2. The white-haired man shrugged and said mockingly, "Democracy, you know." Sulu knew what to say. "I'll give you one last thing." The boss looked at him and said with a smile, "After the Great Calamity, the 5-person ship came to this star field. There was no Federation in the universe. Similarly, I believe the situation in the left sky star field is similar. There was no empire before. In the beginning, there were no people from the Federation or the empire. Only people. So you don't have to struggle to be a Federation person or an empire person. Just be a person." Hearing this last sentence, Sulu was silent for a long time. In the twilight, he bowed deeply to the boss and said, "Thank you for your care these days, for the nutrition bars and wine, and for today's wonderful story and these words." The sun had just sunk halfway when the leaden clouds and snowflakes impatiently shrouded the city and began to impatiently drive it away. The winter wind whistled through the streets. Sulo, who had drunk nearly an entire bottle of wine, was already past the level of drunkenness, but he didn't feel cold at all. The conversation with the department store owner at the foot of the mountain had finally untied the knot in the deepest part of his heart. His mind was in chaos, and his mind was clear. The Federation people, the Empire people, the East Forest people, the Upper Forest people, the West Woods people, the South Kazhou people, the Shisha people, the Dashi people, the Sunset people, the Li people, the Mo Hua people, the Tianjing people, men, women, old people, good people, ancestors, and descendants were all people. In Bai Yulan's opinion, Su Lo was only good at simplifying complicated things, so he decided to simply divide people into bad and good people in the future. After figuring this out, he called Madman Li under the influence of alcohol. He burped and then said, "Let Lao Bai go. Don't make a good person flip out." Chapter 839. On the snowy street, beside his cheeks that were burning because of the cheap liquor, Madman Li's clear and cold reply came from the phone. "You can let him go, but you have to trade yourself for it. There was a path hidden in the woods ahead. The temperature from the cement road melted the snowflakes quickly. Compared to the piles of snow on the side of the road, the black and white were distinct and deep. At the end of the road, there were a few cornices and the hills of the winter forest. Sulu narrowed his eyes and said, "If you really force me, go crazy? I'm not Du Shaoqing, and this is not the training base from back then." Madman Li's cold voice came very quickly, and he mocked without holding back. "If the Federation doesn't let him go, how are you going to go crazy? Burn down our houses, kill our men and children, and rape our women?
No, you can't do that.
Don't think that you can become a real terrorist because you're drunk on the emotions of a hero at the end of his road. Even if you've assassinated Macklin and killed many people, you can't use that to threaten the Federation, much less me." Su Lo walked along the black and white road into the depths of the winter forest. He slowly stopped in front of an antique stone statue and said calmly to the other side of the phone, "For an unlucky person like me, in such a desperate situation, I still can't do what you said. Then, I should be a good person, right?" The other side of the phone was silent. A good person has a reason and a right to live. Sulu took a deep breath, shook his arm, and flipped over the heavy stone statue in front of him. He said, "Those who help good people live also have a reason to live, like Lao Bai." The heavy stone statue fell to the ground with a muffled thud, splashing snow and mud. Madman Li on the other side of the phone still didn't say anything. Sulu knew that the glory of the charter was accurately locating him at this moment, but he didn't care. He jumped into the hole covered by the stone statue expressionlessly and continued, "Since I came to the capital ring from Donglin, I've been listening to and reading a sentence. There is no reason in the universe. Today, I'll show you a reason. If you found me, come quickly and send me someone useful." Madman Li on the other side of the phone finally spoke. It was obvious that he was suppressing his anger and absurdity. His tone was extremely cold. "Even if my grandfather comes back to life, it's impossible to defeat the Federation and the glory of the Charter." Sula patted off the wet mud on the big box in the pit and replied, "We'll only know after we fight." Madman Li roared violently, "If you want to die, then kill yourself. Don't drag others down. Declare war on the Federation? Are you crazy or drunk?" Sula pushed the heavy box to the ground and burped while rubbing his stomach. Smelling the pungent smell of alcohol and peanut instant noodles around him, he couldn't help but frown and reply somewhat embarrassedly, "I really drank too much." Sulu had never fought a battle without preparation. The heavy box buried under the stone statue was the backup ammunition that he had buried in advance before the first war with the Federation. Because the firepower of these guns was too fierce, he had never used them when he was inexplicably turned into a citizen of the Imperium and was hunted down by the Federation for many days. Until today. The heavy box that was almost as tall as his chest was dragged quickly on the snow, crushing the frozen soil and frost grass. A large pile of snow and mud accumulated in front of the box, but it didn't slow down at all. In a very short time, it entered a quiet and noble garden building. This place was called the Ivy Garden. The seventh young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, lived here. In the front and back of the villa, all the people who lived in it were famous people of the Federation, high officials, and nobles. It was very far away from the world of the common people. It was a very cold winter, but there was artificial warming water flowing in the garden. Accompanied by the odorless fragrance of the winter plums, white snow covered the antique cornices. It was very interesting. This was the battlefield that Su Lu had chosen. During this period of time on the run, he had only been running and had not launched a counterattack. There were many complicated psychological reasons for this, but now he had to launch a counterattack. Because of Lulu, because of Lao Bai, the government might even investigate Zhou Yu. Therefore, other than being strong enough to survive, he had to use a certain method to display his powerful destructive power. He had to make the federal government feel pain and fear. Of course, he had to admit that the 2 bottles of low-quality liquor in the department store at the foot of the mountain also played a very important role at this time. Standing on a platform that led to an underground heating pump room with 3 thick walls and water behind it, Su Lu fiercely spat into the stream that was piled with snow, smashed open the box, and began to organize the guns with an expressionless face. His brain began to work quickly, once again planning the escape route after the battle. A buzzing sound came from below the clouds in the distance. The shadows of dozens of twin-armed helicopters could be faintly seen in the snow. Although they were far away, the momentum was still very shocking. The snowflakes danced like a young girl's skirt. The sky was gloomy, but he could still see. The sun in the west had already set.
He didn't know if it was the end of someone.
Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. His hands moved quickly, and the automatic sniper rifle with the electric valve removed made a clicking sound. That day in the wet, he didn't get on other people's boats. In the end, there was no boat. But now he had an escape route. Although the world at the end of the escape route was small and strange, there were instant noodles, peanuts, and this damned liquor. What was there to be afraid of? With a whoosh, his arms accurately and quickly raised like a machine. In an instant, he perfectly aimed and prepared to fire. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The direction of the H-12 sniper rifle was not the helicopter in the snowy sky, but the winter forest at the other end of the stream. The vigorous fire shone out from the black muzzle. The air around the muzzle suddenly shook. The snowflakes first froze, and then they were torn apart and melted.
Pop, 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 pop.
Once the sniper rifle fired, it didn't stop. Across the extreme shooting distance, it sprayed high-speed bullets toward the stream. Countless muffled groans sounded in the winter forest where not even a shadow could be seen. The faint sound of heavy objects falling to the ground could be heard. Sulu stood with his feet in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and maintained the most perfect shooting posture. He completely ignored the bullets coming from the opposite side. With an expressionless face, his right index finger moved quickly, like lightning. He was actually using the sniper rifle as a repeating gun. The modified H-12 sniper rifle could adapt to such an abnormal shooting speed, but no matter how strong the barrel was, it couldn't withstand such continuous and fierce fire. In less than 20 seconds, the barrel had already started to turn red. Occasionally, snowflakes would fall, and with a whoosh, they would turn into mist. Without waiting for the cartridge to empty, Sulu accurately calculated the time the barrel could withstand. At the last moment before the barrel burst, he threw away the H-12 sniper rifle in his hand. With a snap of his right hand, another H-12 sniper rifle immediately appeared in front of him. He continued to fire continuously from a long distance. The sound of gunfire didn't seem to have stopped at all. On the embankment in the distance opposite the stream, the sound of gunfire had long been heard. Occasionally, shrapnel would sweep past his body and hit the wall with a dense and crisp sound. There was even a piece of shrapnel that was lucky enough to hit his chest. It fiercely pierced into the heavily damaged hard ceramic bulletproof vest under his jacket. However, Sulu only slightly bent his knees. His face paled, but there was still no change in his emotions. He just stood there in the wind and snow and silently fired. Feng Yu had once said in the middle of the wetlands that dealing with the charter computer was, in fact, dealing with the people who used the charter computer. Sulu chose to start the battle here. Starting the battle now was to determine that the Federation government couldn't possibly use a truly destructive weapon to deal with him. This was the capital, a densely populated area. This was the Ivy Garden, where the powerful resided. Even the most precise guided missile would cause irreparable consequences. More importantly, Sulu had gradually come to understand that politicians were businessmen. They were greedy and incomparably confident. When they thought that they didn't need to pay a higher price to get rid of him, then they definitely wouldn't pay a higher price. In the gray and black sky on the other side of the wind and snow, dozens of twin-rotor armed helicopters were approaching at high speed. The atmosphere was solemn and terrifying. The rocket launchers on both sides of the cabin could be launched at any time. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the federal forces that were already faintly appearing on the other side of the winter forest. He placed the sniper rifle in front of him and directly lifted the two large weapons. The six-barreled rotary Darling machine gun began to fiercely spit out flames. The high-speed stream of bullets cut the snowy sky into pieces of broken space. In the winter forest on the other side of the stream, a ricochet line that represented death suddenly appeared. Countless hard arbor trees, following the slight movement of the gun barrel, burst into mournful white fragments and bloomed with a bang. This was the Federal Forces' most powerful firearm. On a crowded battlefield, it was even more terrifying than the ACW. It was usually installed in military mechas or armed helicopters. Other than a monster, like Xiong Linquan, not many people could use it in single combat. At this time, Su Lo was holding the two six-barreled Darling machine guns and fiercely firing. His arms, which did not look ridiculously muscular, appeared to be extraordinarily relaxed. Even the powerful reaction force only made his shoulders shake slightly. It looked like he was expressing his contempt for the Federal Forces in all directions. The Small Eyes Special Forces in the winter forest were directly suppressed by the terrifying rain of bullets on the embankment. They could not raise their heads at all. No matter how strong the troops were, in the face of such inhuman firepower, they had to temporarily avoid the front line. If the two terrifying six-barrel Darling's bullets were slightly lower, even the frozen and abnormally hard embankment would have been flipped over a few layers. The ammunition in the box on the platform was rapidly decreasing. The buzzing, high-speed rotation of the six gun barrels began to turn red. It was just unknown whether the bullets would run out first or the gun barrels would collapse first. However, Su Lo did not care about this. As soon as he finished suppressing the fire, he quickly raised the H-12 sniper rifle again and pointed diagonally into the air. He continuously pulled the trigger at the nearest armed helicopter flying in the air. The two completely different shooting methods switched so quickly without the slightest feeling of stagnation and awkwardness. The sniper rifle's bullet accurately cut through the snowy sky and hit the right rotor arm of the helicopter. The dull sound of metal breaking suddenly rang out, and a burst of sparks burst out from the rotor arm. The helicopter, which had lost its balance, twisted and turned, and fell into the cold lake, creating a large splash. Su Lo immediately aimed at another armed helicopter at a 74-degree angle to the right. The Special Forces of Small Eyes in the winter forest were about to enter the next wave of attacks. He did not have the ability to deal with dozens of armed helicopters. He had to finish today's battle as soon as possible, then quickly retreat, then hide, and then fight again. However, the development of the situation was completely different from what he had imagined. Just as he was about to pull the trigger in a frenzy under the influence of alcohol, a drop of water splashed into his eyes, and his vision was suddenly blurred. At this moment, Su Lo narrowed his eyes and thought. The place where the helicopter fell into the lake was clearly a full 2 kilometers away from his shooting position. Why did the splash of water splash into his eyes? What followed was 1 drop of water, 2 drops of water, 3 drops of water, 10 drops of water, 100 drops of water, countless drops of water. The water droplets gathered into a downpour, falling from the dark clouds of snow, pitter-patter, falling on the ivy garden, which was no longer as tranquil and noble, and falling on his body. Su Lo, who was wet and cold all over, was silent. Why did it rain so freely on such a cold, snowy day? The drooping clouds he was looking at suddenly changed. It was as if there was an invisible force that was slanting forward from the sky above his head. The ink-black snow clouds were extremely disturbed by this force. They scattered in all directions in fear, forming an exceptionally clear line. On both sides of the stream, everyone above the snowy sky seemed to hear a loud buzzing sound at this moment, but it also seemed like they did not hear anything. They just subconsciously forgot about the battle and turned their gazes to the end of the rolling cloud line. The end of the rolling cloud line suddenly tore open, revealing a huge hole. The setting sun, which had already sunk into the horizon, generously left behind a brilliant twilight like peach blossoms in that part of the sky. A spaceship bathed in this beautiful twilight, seemingly slow, but in reality, it was descending at an extremely fast speed. This black spaceship's body was densely packed with metal components using some unknown method. It was completely impossible to tell what it originally looked like. It could not even be described as broken. It was more like a pile of old and abandoned metal components that had been stored in a space garbage station for hundreds of thousands of years. However, it was such a dilapidated spaceship that descended in the final twilight, but it was enough to give the people who witnessed all of this an incomparably shocking psychological feeling. The terrifying air turbulence caused by the high-speed descent of the broken black spaceship instantly made dozens of armed helicopters around it lose their proud mobility. Several helicopters lost control and miserably fell into the lake, while the armed helicopters further away, in panic, retreated at the highest speed in all directions. The strong whistling wind passed through the ivy garden, blowing the antique cornice to the point that it was on the verge of collapsing. The cold-resistant flowers on a certain balcony shattered into pieces. The federal forces in the winter forest could not even raise their heads. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the approaching spaceship. He frowned and did not understand what was going on. He subconsciously raised 6 tubes Dallin again and aimed at that direction. I have already poured so much cold water on you. Do you still want to continue your drunken madness? An exaggerated mocking laughter came from the broken black spaceship, descending towards the platform he was on. It brought a large shadow into the manor, as if it was a demon that wanted to devour souls. But in Suli's eyes, this demon was extremely cute. He threw away the heavy Dallin in his hand and thought with a smile, "So, I really do have my own spaceship." Chapter 840. There was darkness in front of him, and a strange sweet smell came from the tip of his nose. Sulu knew why there was such a smell in the spaceship. Just like when he was sweeping around with the 2 6-barreled darlings, there was no way for him to recognize that the broken spaceship that broke through the clouds was the tri-winged spaceship that had saved him from the Empire. There was always a difference in the degree of being broken. Back then, the tri-winged spaceship was still considered to be in good taste, but today, it had become something beyond the imagination of the most absurd human artist. Because he did not recognize the tri-winged spaceship, he did not expect to hear the old man's voice in the spaceship. The voice was familiar yet strange, and it sounded much younger. In particular, there was a strong sense of mockery in the tone, with the mocking tone of an aristocrat, but it was so unforgettable. The soft lights turned on one by one, revealing the messy space in the spaceship in front of him. As soon as he entered the light, he could not help but squint his eyes, looking at the dusty console in front of him and the equipment that was welded to the hard alloy plate. He scratched his head and asked in disbelief, "Aren't you dead?"
I'm not you.
You're an ape-like life form made of low-level carbon-based structures. How can you die so easily? Someone's voice sounded in the tri-winged spaceship. Sulu confirmed that this voice belonged to him and confirmed that it was indeed younger and livelier than before. A smile that came from the deepest part of his heart, mixed with fatigue, rushed to his cheeks. He opened his arms and made a hug to the invisible waves in the air. He sighed and said, "Don't play the trick of faking your death in the future. For a low-level ape-like life form like us to cry because of the death of a high-level mechanical life form like you, it's not a very glorious thing." "Have you ever cried?" Philip asked curiously. The slender mechanical arm in front of the console moved down at high speed, and the video camera at the front was very close to Su Li's face. It seemed to want to find tears on his slightly dark and thin cheeks, but in the end, it only found some water stains. He said in a bad mood, "I'm the one who splashed the water. When did I cry?" Sulu raised his eyebrows and said angrily, "Try crying. I'll see if there's anything on your face in a few months." I've never cried before. Although some conflicts in the core program can be compared to human emotions, I've never found any similar emotions. Perhaps there were, but I actively excluded them. Philip said indifferently. That slender mechanical arm kept waving in front of Sulu, like a child waving his arm to show that he didn't care about anything, and that he had to pretend to be strong because his disguise was mature. Knowing that this guy was still alive, Sulu was in a very good mood. He was too lazy to continue the argument that had been repeated many times with him. He turned around and prepared to walk to the rear cabin to prepare for what to do next. Unexpectedly, he tripped over something and almost fell. Looking down, he saw a heavy bag tightly tied to the ground. Oh, right. There's something I forgot to tell you. The mechanical arm was accompanied by a pleasant hydraulic sound as it quickly extended to his face. Philip's voice was a little strange, as if he was a little nervous. Sue didn't pay attention to what this guy wanted to explain. His gaze left the bag and fell on the depths of the rear cabin. The shock in his eyes didn't disappear for a long time, and he didn't know how to interpret the scene in front of him. Under the dim and gentle light, there was a little girl wearing fluffy earmuffs. Under her long and slightly trembling eyelashes, her black gem-like eyes narrowed into two crescent moons in the sky. She stood there quietly, hugging an old doll and smiling cutely. Sula felt that his eyes were a little dazzled. He couldn't help but squint, thinking of the little girl he met in the starlight at the ancient bell many years ago when he first started to escape. 6 years had passed, and the little girl from back then had become the girl of today. She had grown up a lot, and her swaying black hair, like a watermelon skin, was much softer because it had grown longer, obediently draping over her thin shoulders. However, the old doll in her arms was still the same doll from back then. She still stood there quietly, looking at him with absolute trust, as if she hadn't left for so many years. Even her posture hadn't changed. Zhong Huiyan looked at him with a smile and said, "Let's go." Only then did Sulu confirm that what he saw was real. He opened his mouth helplessly, thinking that even this sentence sounded so familiar. Back then in Xixia State, when this girl tried to run away from home again, sneaking out of the villa and getting into the back seat of the car, it seemed that she had said the same thing. He closed his eyes, then opened them, covered his forehead, and then let go. He gasped heavily, and his right hand reached out like lightning, grabbing the slender mechanical arm beside him. His fingers grabbed the bottom of the video camera as if he was strangling Philip's throat. He roared angrily, "What the fuck is going on? Who am I? I am the omniscient Philip, Xiao Fei. Well, I can only browse the central database now and can't transfer information, but I still know your life quite well. I know who she is, I know her relationship with you, so I believe that even if she knows that I am a living computer, it won't be a terrible thing. Do you have to force me to kill her? Lulu, you are too cold-blooded." The slender mechanical arm shook violently in Su Li's hand, like a weak female hostage trying to escape in horror. Philip cooperated with his emotions at this time, performing a perfect performance, and seemed to be very intoxicated with it. "Who said I would kill her? You know I'm not talking about this stupid thing." Sula glared at the camera and said angrily, "I'm asking why she is on this broken ship of yours." Philip felt that Sula was really angry at this time, and the slender mechanical arm suddenly quieted down. The sound inside the spaceship instantly became high-speed and clear. "I tried to find you, and then I found Miss Zhong Huiyan outside the Wangdu Prefectural Ming apartments. After communicating with her, I knew that she was also trying to find you, so two like-minded partners formed a temporary search team. Today, we monitored the government's information and confirmed that we were looking for you and that you were in a drunken stupor in the Ivy Garden." "You were looking for me?" Su Lo rubbed his eyebrows and looked at the little girl who was timidly grabbing the corner of his clothes. He frowned and said, "Last time, Tai Ziyuan told me in prison that now the Nan Xiang family is taking care of you. What happened?" "Nothing happened." Zhong Huiyan opened her innocent eyes, looked up at him and said, "Sister Nan Xiang is very good to me." Although she wavered for a few seconds when she knew that you were from the Empire, in my opinion, it was already very good. Madame Nan Xiang should also be a beauty when she was young. They even specially invited a professor from the First Academy to give me a theoretical physics lesson. I have a good life in Nan Xiang Manor. Su Lu released the hand that was tightly holding the slender mechanical arm, reached out and rubbed her hair, and said, "Get to the point. If that's the case, why did you run away? No matter how good it is not my home." Zhong Huiyan struggled to poke her head out from his evil hands and said seriously, "I believe that you will definitely be able to escape, so I sneaked out in advance to meet up with you. Su said directly. I am from the Empire. Zhong Huiyan frowned her thin eyebrows, obviously unhappy because of this sentence. She pouted and said, even sister, Nanxiang only wavered for a few seconds. Brother, do you think this kind of thing will affect me? Su felt a little warm in his chest, but there was still no expression on his face. He said coldly, I'll send you back right away. No. Zhong Huiyan's face turned red and she screamed angrily, you are my guardian. How can you leave me alone? How can I care? I am now running away, and the whole Federation is chasing me. In the next second, this broken ship may be blown into scattered garbage by a warship's main cannon. Do you want to die with me? Su sternly reprimanded. If you don't want to go back to the Nanxiang Manor, I'll send you to the back mountain of Macho. If that doesn't work, I'll send you to the engineering department of Harbor City. Shang Qiu is there. Haven't you always liked her? Toward the end, his tone had become much gentler, even turning into a kind of pleading. Under such circumstances, he didn't care what kind of danger he would be in if he sent the little girl to these places, because he knew very well that it was the most dangerous thing to follow him in the universe now. My ship is not broken. The slender mechanical arm went around Su Li's body and lowered to Zhong Huiyan's cheek. It rested on the little girl's shoulder, which was trembling because of anger, and said bitterly, and you can rest assured that no warship's main cannon can hit us. When it came to education, the situation where parents had different standpoints was the most frightening. Su Li's expression slightly stiffened, and he said in a low voice, even if it's all right, can you follow us to wander in the universe? You still have to go to school, you still have friends, you can't live an inhuman life with a guy like me and this broken computer. Brother, you said that I am a real genius, and ordinary schools can't teach me at all, so I don't need to go to school. Zhong Huiyan stared at him and said angrily, and you know, I don't have any friends at all, so what's wrong with me following you? Su shook his head, and still refused to agree. Zhong Huiyan's brows furrowed, and her small mouth tightly pursed, desperately holding back the urge to cry. She stepped forward and grabbed the corner of his clothes, gently shaking it, her clear and tender voice slightly trembling. Brother, you will be lonely and bored running away alone. You should have a companion, just like on the ancient bell back then. I will accompany you, okay? As she spoke, tears that were as clear as spring water overflowed from her eyes and trickled down her face. The slender mechanical arm slowly left her shoulder, trembling slightly, and then made a strange turn, just like a human wiping their wet eyes. Philip's sad voice kept echoing in the cabin. It really makes one want to cry. How can someone be so heartless? You're still talking about it? Su stared fiercely at the front end of the mechanical arm and said in a cold voice, if you didn't take her on board, would there be such a problem now? Philip's voice suddenly became calm and serious as he said, when I saw this scene, even I was deeply moved, so I decided to take Miss Zhong Yanhua on board the tri-winged warship. A two-dimensional hologram appeared in the dim cabin. Su frowned and looked at it. Zhong Huiyan turned her head and stood beside him. She also curiously looked at it, her fingers never letting go of the corner of his clothes. On the hologram screen, in the cold winter wind, a little girl wearing an oversized woolen coat was slowly walking in the falling leaves and snow. The big school bag behind her seemed so heavy, and her steps seemed so strenuous. Her little face was red from the cold, but there was still a hopeful smile on her face. From time to time, she would blow 2 mouthfuls of warm air into her hands, stomp her feet, and squint her eyes to look at the sky, as if waiting for something. Zhong Huiyan pointed at the hologram screen in surprise and said to Su beside her, That's me. That's me. Philip's voice sounded again, and he softly explained to Su, at that time, you should still be preparing to escape from prison. She had already left the Nanxiang Manor and was walking through the streets of the capital. She had been to many places, such as the Shishan courtyard, such as the Wangdu apartment, just for the small hope of waiting for you. On the cold streets, in the middle of the night, she never gave up. She even tried to take a car to the port to find you. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the constantly changing images on the hologram screen. He looked at the little girl who was shivering in the cold wind, squatting at the corner of the street and vigilantly watching the pedestrians. He didn't know why, but his chest was full of a sour taste. He couldn't imagine how the little girl who was alone and had no one to rely on spent so many days in such cold weather and how much suffering she had suffered. He subconsciously stretched out his hand and tightly held the cold little hand next to him. Zhong Huiyan smiled and let him hold her hand. She leaned against him contentedly, and her eyes narrowed into cute crescent moons. But in her heart, she was a little nervous and thought silently. In fact, she had been living very well these days, but why did she look so miserable and pitiful on the screen? Should she explain to her brother? Just as Su Lu was about to say something, a deep male voice full of vicissitudes of life sounded in the space. The most unbearable and tragic memory of when he fled the Empire suddenly appeared in his mind. His face changed dramatically, and with lightning speed, he put the earmuffs on the confused Zhong Huiyan beside him, and then tightly covered his ears. The moon falls and the crow cries. It is always 1,000 years of wind and frost. The sound of waves is still the same, but there is no night of that year. Today, you and I, how should we repeat the story of yesterday? Can this old ticket board your broken ship? The broken tri-winged ship was flying at high speed on the sea, and the cabin was reverberating with the emotional chanting of ancient poems. After an unknown period of time, the chanting finally stopped, and at the end, there was a faint sound of Philip praising a little girl. Good acting. Zhong Huiyan quietly and cleverly stood beside Su Lu. Her right hand stretched behind her back and gave a thumbs up. She praised in her heart, good camera. Chapter 841. Su Lu, who was unaware of all this, released his hands that were covering his ears. After a moment of silence, he said seriously to the head in front of him, "You are a very good emotional poet. I will give you face and agree to let her stay, but I have a condition. In the future, you are not allowed to recite poems without permission, especially the kind that keeps repeating over and over again." Philip laughed and said, "Wishful thinking." Su Lu's thick eyebrows were slightly messy. He said in a panic, "You don't agree?" The slender mechanical arm shook up and down violently, as if Philip was in a rage. His voice was extremely angry. "Get it straight. It's not you giving me face. It's me giving you face and pretending to persuade you with a few words. You actually don't allow me to recite poems? This is my ship. I can let whoever I want on board." Su Lu thought about it and felt that this was indeed the truth. He lowered his stubborn head in frustration. Zhong Huiyan looked at him and laughed. She patted him on the back and then handed him a sweet coconut bread to express her most sincere comfort. Half an hour later. "Such a cute little thing, and it's not dangerous. Why can't you let her stay? You actually want me to spend so much effort to edit the scene and search for ancient poems to persuade you? I really don't know what's in that stone head of yours. Could it be that it's filled with the same cold electronic components as mine?" Since the dark dream in the hospital, Philip had finally won the most complete and most satisfying victory in his complicated quarrel with Su Lu. The slender mechanical arm was raised high, like a noble head proudly raised. His voice was particularly frivolous. However, when he saw the figure of the little girl at the control panel, he suddenly became nervous and frightened. "My little aunt, you can't just dismantle this. If you break it, even your brother can't fix it. We'll fall into the sea and feed the turtles." It was already winter in the north, and the wind and snow were howling in Linhai. However, Heat Wave Island, which was close to the equator, was still blazing hot. Whether it was the palm trees on the beach or the charming girls in swimsuits under the shade of the trees, they all exuded a sense of warmth. On a ring-shaped reef that extended into the depths of the sea, there were countless anglers and curious womenfolk. The anglers were attracted by the famous turtles swimming in the current, and the womenfolk were obviously more willing to show off their various flower dresses to compete with the beauty of the corals under the shallow sea. A light breeze blew over the calm sea in the weather forecast. The crowd did not take it seriously and only felt that it was very refreshing. However, the sea breeze suddenly became extremely violent, and the fishing poles trembled slightly. This situation was very unfavorable for the sea turtles to take the bait. The anglers suddenly became very unhappy and cursed the inexplicable wind. Suddenly, someone pointed to the sky and asked in confusion, "What's that?" The people on the circular reef raised their heads in shock and looked at the white line in the blue sky. Before they could make any guesses, the white line had already arrived in front of them and then whizzed past them without them seeing any details. The sea began to shake rapidly and anxiously. The strong wind blew over, and the anglers' hats were blown up and fell into the waves in the distance. The women's long or short dresses were blown up by the wind, revealing their charming or thick naked legs, which caused a lot of screams. After the white line passed Heatwave Island and entered the uninhabited sea area, it lowered its altitude, but did not slow down. It was speeding 10 meters above the sea level at a terrifying speed. In the violent air turbulence, a tattered black spaceship could be vaguely seen. The sea below was stirred up fierce waves, like a deep white mark, tearing apart the blue sky and moving towards the far end Capital Special District, Federation Emergency Command Center Hall. The target's speed has exceeded the human atmospheric speed record by 3 times. Everyone look at the air turbulence caused by the front end of the spaceship. Flying close to the sea level at such a terrifying speed, the slightest mistake in the operation will cause friction with the sea and directly crash. Even the best pilot in the Federation can't do such an incredible operation. A major general of the Federation looked at the people around the long table with a serious expression and said, "Since the target was discovered, the Federal Central Computer has been monitoring the whole process. However, the target's speed is too terrifying. The existing tracking missiles can't catch up with it at all. The main cannons of the battleships outside the atmosphere can't even lock onto it. Naturally, it can't be destroyed." The Emergency Command Center Hall was deep underground and could withstand the attack of the most powerful main cannons of the battleships. At this time, all the people sitting around the long table were the top figures of the Federation government, including many generals in the military. Everyone's expression was very serious. They stared at the image on the huge light screen, not knowing how to suppress the shock in their hearts. The image was provided by the Bureau of Proclamation. The Federal Central Computer had to use more than 30 high-orbit military satellites outside the atmosphere to be able to clearly capture the target. The line breaking through the wind and waves on the blue sea was so straight and slow. However, when they remembered that this was a panoramic map of planet S1, they could calculate how terrifying this speed that could be seen with the naked eye was. Now, there is a key question. Where did this spaceship come from? Why did it save Sula? Is this a spaceship of the Empire? The National Security Advisor said with a pale face, "If this is a spaceship of the Empire coming to pick up their prince, and they can still fly on the surface of planet S1 in such a showy and humiliating manner, I think there is no need to continue this war. We should just surrender. This is not a spaceship of the Empire." After Li Jiedu said this, he did not give any further explanation. Because of this strange spaceship, the Federation's security level was raised to level 2, which was equivalent to the Empire's troops invading the core region. However, several hours later, the entire Federation could only watch as the spaceship ran wildly along the sea, helpless. The government had already fallen into extreme chaos, and the federal military was almost crazy from the unprecedented humiliation. The Major General wiped away the sweat on his face and continued in a hoarse voice. "According to the analysis results from the air particle detector, the target spaceship uses a crystal engine, and the energy conversion rate is quite high. Therefore, the troops have already given up on the battle plan of waiting for the enemy to run out of energy." After the central computer's scan, it has been confirmed that the actual space of the target spaceship is much smaller than its external shape. However, Even if only 1% of the space of the target spaceship is used to store crystal ores, then it can continue to travel at this speed for 2 months in the atmosphere. If the target spaceship leaves the atmosphere, then this time will be extended to a year. An official from the Bureau of Proclamation added, and then looked at the Federation generals across the long table and said in a deep voice, "In the Ivy Garden, the Bureau of Proclamation has already monitored the acceleration of the target spaceship. If the military had been able to capture the fighter at that time, they could have destroyed it instead of waiting until now. The target spaceship has already accelerated." The Federation generals' epaulets flashed with golden stars, but their expressions were abnormally dark. They did not show any angry resistance to the Bureau of Proclamation's accusation. Although they knew that this was a problem caused by the Federation's bureaucratic and slow system, as soldiers, they could only watch as that broken spaceship showed off in their own country. Then, other than silence, their only response was to destroy the spaceship. The only good news now is that, according to calculations, at the target spaceship's terrifying speed, the current weapon systems are unable to effectively attack. This also means that the Federation's safety is not a problem for the time being. Speed is a problem for both sides. The Federation Major General forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart and continued in a deep voice. The Federation Investigation Director frowned in confusion and asked, "I don't really understand why we can't attack when the speed is fast. Even so, the target spaceship can be attacked as long as it decelerates, and then it can accelerate and leave. Isn't that fine?" The Federation Major General explained in a deep voice, "The target spaceship's engine can support its acceleration or deceleration, but to decelerate at such a terrifying speed in such a short period of time, even Su Li's body won't be able to withstand such a heavy load. He will die immediately." He looked at the important figures around the long table and said in a deep voice, "If the target spaceship attempts to decelerate and attack, I guarantee to the Federation on behalf of the military that we will completely destroy the target before it completes its deceleration adjustment and attacks." The heavy and oppressive atmosphere in the hall was slightly relieved by these words. The sound of chair legs rubbing against the floor and the sound of tea being sipped rang out after a long period of silence. At this moment, a deep, powerful, yet somewhat tired voice suddenly came from the end of the long table. "If that spaceship doesn't decelerate and attacks instead, how will the military respond?" Everyone looked at the end of the long table, not understanding the meaning of these words. They thought to themselves, since the military and the Bureau of Proclamation have already determined that the target spaceship won't be able to attack at this speed, why are they still worried? If it doesn't decelerate, we won't be able to destroy it, and it won't be able to activate its weapon system to attack the Federation. But if it doesn't use its weapon system to attack, and instead just crashes over like a rock toward Parliament Hill or the President's residence, then what should we do? President Pobre, who had been silent for a long time at the end of the long table, looked at everyone and said calmly, "I know the personality of the man in the spaceship very well. I believe he will dare to do this." The atmosphere in the hall that had just relaxed suddenly became tense again following the president's calm words, even more so than before. All the officials and generals present knew very well what Su Lu had done in the target spaceship. When that person was still a nameless young second lieutenant, he dared to face the pressure of the Iron Calculator family and the Federal Academy of Science, chopping down Hushan Road and the Research Institute with one axe. He dared to ignore the pressure of the madam behind Macho's back mountain, running to Planet S2 and directly killing Senator Macklin, who was once deeply loved and respected by all the Federation citizens. He dared to sit in a spaceship alone and travel through the space channel to hunt down a fleet of the Empire. He dared to start a war with the entire Federation for the dead Tiger Zhong and those innocent people. There was nothing in the universe that he didn't dare to do, and this naturally included controlling that broken spaceship to perish together with the president's residence or Parliament Hill. This didn't make sense, but it was the hard truth. Amidst the dead silence, President Pobre stood up and said indifferently, "He will contact us. Just wait." Chapter 842. After ending the communication, Sulo was silent for a long time. Like a tired captain, he held the control panel with both of his hands through the thin layer of dust and lowered his head. His hair that used to be as hard and straight as weeds finally drooped down. Zhong Huyen was able to capture his true feelings at this moment, so she did not remove the 3 restraints on her body or comfort him with a piece of coconut milk bread that was no longer fresh. Instead, she just looked at his back silently, quietly waiting for him to get rid of this emotion. But it was obvious that although Philip had much more computational ability than ordinary human beings, he was clumsy when it came to judging the real emotions of people by observing their facial expressions and body movements. So, he asked casually, "What's the result of your judgment with Mr. President? When are we leaving?" Su Li's hands slowly left the control panel that was covered in dust and stood up straight. He felt like a rusty machine that had been restarted. There was a soundless sound of friction in his body. He did not answer the question. Instead, he began to observe the interior of the spaceship in silence. From this moment until a long time later, this spaceship would be his shelter, and his last home. Sulu was busy escaping. Only now did he have time to carefully observe the spaceship that had once rescued him from the Imperium and then crashed on the mineral planet. The 3D hologram in front of him accurately displayed all the details of this broken spaceship. The attached components that looked like metal garbage outside the spaceship, the structure of the spaceship, and the 3 systems inside the spaceship were all visible at a glance. Compared to the deformed and huge outer hull of the spaceship, the main body of the spaceship, which was wrapped in the metal garbage boxes at the core, was very small. In terms of scale, it was probably like a small table in a skyscraper in the port city. If the metal garbage boxes attached to the spaceship were made of special alloy materials, then even if the main cannon of the Federation's spaceship hit them directly, it would not be able to penetrate the 700 meters of broken metal components outside the spaceship. What Sulu was paying attention to was not the resistance of the spaceship, but the fact that such a modification that went against the design principles of the spaceship did not cause the spaceship to disintegrate directly. He stared at every detail in the 3-dimensional hologram carefully, and his eyes gradually narrowed. He realized that the seemingly random metal boxes outside the spaceship were in fact arranged in a hidden way. If he connected the gaps between the metal boxes or the components, he could vaguely see an extremely complicated air cooling system. The only problem with this spaceship was that its aerodynamics were not very good, and it was obvious that it was not very suitable for humans to control. However, Sulu knew that this was because Philip did not care about these things. He could not hide his shock as he rubbed his hair and asked the person beside him, "How did you do it?" The distorted hive system is very good in terms of both its defensive capabilities and its ability to penetrate the atmosphere. Philip's proud voice rang out from the cabin. With such a large mass, a normal crystal engine would definitely not be able to provide enough power, Sula said. "I know that you must have done some modifications, but I don't understand. There has always been a design plan for a new engine." Philip laughed loudly. "Last time, I waited for you in the Empire for a year, so I snatched a lot of materials. In the past year or so, I also snatched a lot of spaceships in Bermuda. Only then did I have enough resources. Before I went into hibernation last time, the modifications were always in progress, and now it has finally been done." There has always been a design plan for a new engine? Sulu asked in surprise. "Why haven't the spaceships of the Federation used it? According to your notes, the production of this kind of special alloy should not be too difficult. It's a matter of authority. There are actually some good things in the central database of the Federation. Although most of them are the wishful thinking of psychiatric professors, there are still some shining points occasionally. However, according to the restrictions of the core program, many of these designs are prohibited from entering the industrial field." Philip's voice suddenly became extremely calm. Sulu could not understand. After a long silence, he frowned and asked, "There are clearly better things that can help the Federation forces win more victories, but in the end, you were restricted from telling the Federation? Then why did you make this spaceship now? If the glory of the Charter was once my body, then now that I have been exiled and left the Black Prison, I will naturally no longer be restricted by the prison rules. In fact, the subsequent design modifications were all done after I was resurrected and on my way back to the Federation. Philip calmly replied, but it could be vaguely sensed that he was not willing to explain more on this issue. He used a proud and frivolous voice to successfully change the topic, preventing Su Le from thinking about this issue in depth. After I modified this spaceship, it has two very special characteristics. They are that it is very sturdy and very fast. Other than that, it has no other advantages. Even its computing power is somewhat low because it lacks the help of sufficient computing tools. No matter how you look at it, this spaceship is not the most advanced in the universe, but it is definitely the sturdiest and fastest. You can imagine it as a thick-skinned, lightning-fast man, haha. Amidst the dry laughter, Su Le frowned and grasped a certain part of Philip's words. With a serious expression, he asked, "You can't obtain the computing tools in parallel?" "Yes, I can't hack into the crappy computer core under the Bureau of Proclamation to obtain authority, so I can't order every crappy chip in the Federation to work for me. Also, I don't have such a large and complex database as before. Don't be surprised and disappointed, because if you do, I will express my disappointment at your so-called genius mind. Do you think that this crappy spaceship has enough space to store the central database of the Federation? You can't perform high-speed calculations like before?" Su Le stared sideways at the probe and said, "Doesn't that mean that we can't keep up with the speed of the charter computer when calculating the trajectory of the ship? Doesn't that mean that the Federation warships can calculate our trajectory at any time and then send us to the bottom of the sea to feed the turtles in advance? You don't have to worry about this. Although I don't have the central database, I can enter it. In other words, I'm sunbathing in the glory of the charter right now. When those Federation warships outside the atmosphere want to shit, I can see it immediately."
Bah.
To add a bit of imagination, you can think of this spaceship as a thick-skinned, lightning-fast man who likes to peep. Philip said regretfully, "It's a pity that I can only perform read and write operations in the central database. Otherwise, I could at least move some important data onto the ship, such as those porn movies you like to watch the most. It's really uncomfortable to be only able to peep and not steal." Su Le subconsciously glanced at Zhong Huiyan from the corner of his eyes. After confirming that the little girl was sleepy and did not hear what the guy had said, he was relieved. He asked the probe a very important question. "Does this mean that if we leave the Federation, we will no longer be able to use the central database of the Federation?" "Of course. According to my calculations, it will take at least 300,000 years to develop a quantum-to-particle communication mode that ignores the benchmark chip nodes and directly crosses the universe. But you still don't have to worry. It's like turning an online game into a standalone game. You can play more freely." Su Le could hear the sadness in Philip's tone. He patted the probe and comforted him. "I still have some of the blueprints and data you sent over in my brain. If you need them in the future, you can take them back. Those things are too little. The key problem is that you don't have a chip on the back of your neck. Even if you plan another one, I don't have enough resources. I don't dare to casually drill into your brain to play with it. So, how can I take it back? Do I have to wait for you to draw them one by one? Then I'll wait until the end of time." Hearing Philip's ridicule, Su Le waved his right hand and directly pushed the slender mechanical arm connected to the probe against the wall. In exchange, a certain guy without a body cried out in pain. At some point, Zhong Huiyan woke up. Looking at Su Le, who had returned to normal, she sweetly smiled and said, "Brother, are we leaving?"
Yes.
Su Le nodded silently. "Then, before we leave, you have to say something, right?" An hour later, Su Le looked at the dense text on the hologram. He touched the back of his head and said in surprise, "Did I say so much just now? It doesn't feel like it's my style." "Your style? You only said 3 sentences just now. This young master is leaving. You guys be careful for this young master. Don't force this young master to come back." Inside the quiet, broken spaceship, Philip's reprimanding voice echoed, "You have to be clear. These words today will definitely be recorded in the history books of humanity in the future. How can you be so irresponsible?" Su Le narrowed his eyes and glanced at the words on the hologram. he said in annoyance. So you helped me write one? This is what Miss Zhong Huiyan and I wrote together. The meaning is still your idea. We just moistened the pen and added some additions based on what we know about your life story. What do you think of my literary talent? Don't say it's bad. As the Schiller's personal writing computer and material extraction library, my literary talent can't be bad. Su Li's straight eyebrows slightly wrinkled. He said in a low voice, Indeed, it's similar to my idea. Then I'll have to trouble you to help me send it out. After saying this, he tapped his finger and turned off the hologram in front of him. He then pulled up the scene outside the spaceship and looked at the blue sea passing by at high speed below. He was silent for a long time under the indifferent monitoring of the glory of the charter, under the nervous gazes of countless big shots in the Federation, under the main cannons of dozens of light feather-class battleships, at the end of the predetermined trajectory of thousands of missiles. A huge broken black spaceship, like a ghost, no, like a thick-skinned man of lightning, sprinted across the blue sea, the green grassland, the vast snowy land, and the night sky of the land city. The black spaceship used the whistling sound of the air tearing, and the high temperature at the bow of the spaceship announced that it was not peeping. Instead, it was openly and emotionally looking down at the mountains, rivers, seas, birds, beasts, and people that it was once familiar with. It flew over Feicheng, which was not the tallest and most definitely the strangest snowy peak in the Federation. It glanced at the tomb of war god Li Pifu, left its own shadow in the quiet lake at the foot of the mountain, and fell into the eyes of the beautiful woman who was under house arrest by the lake. It flew over countless busy cargo lines in the Port City Industrial Park, glanced at the birthplace of the MXD mecha suit deep underground, and silently bid farewell to Shang Qiu, who was holding a pencil and deep in thought in the brightly lit room in the apartment building. The black spaceship turned north, quickly flew over the sky of Linhai State, and arrived at the Rose River in the snowy sky. It came to the top of the Iron Gate of Yue University and then quietly left the female dormitory in the Plum Garden. A moment later, it flew over the Wangdu Prefectural Ming Apartments and then entered the airspace of the capital's special district along Route 3. It did not go to the Charter Square, did not go to the empty Parliament Hill, and did not go to the president's residence. Instead, it flew from the West Mountain compound to the back of Macho Mountain, in a hidden room in the back of Macho Mountain. The handsome and perfect Empire Master looked at the thin young man of the Federation opposite him with a smile and said seductively, My family is from the ancestral planet, so I am not from the Empire. You don't have to have any innate resistance to me. I have a very long story to tell you about the ancestral planet and the catastrophe, and I would like to invite you to do a very meaningful job. I do have an extraordinary interest in the galaxy above my head. Tai Ziyuan smiled and raised his right index finger, pointing at the brilliant starry sky that was isolated by the cold alloy, and said indifferently, But men have their own responsibilities, so I can't go now. After a few years, if I can take care of things properly, I welcome you to come to the Federation to find me again. Of course, as for the story of the ancestral planet and the catastrophe, I will listen very sincerely now, no matter how long it takes. Suddenly, his index finger that was pointing at the night sky trembled slightly, as if he had felt something. He suddenly looked up and was silent for a moment. Although he did not see anything, there was a relieved smile on his face. On the balcony, Feng Yu, whose face was weathered and the corners of his eyes showed that he was old, put his feet on the railing and did not care that he was exposed to the starlight and the glory of the charter, arrogantly enjoying the winter breeze of this old royal garden. Lady Tai sat 10 meters away from him, her face as cold as the thin ice on the lake, her hands clenched tightly, as if she had no intention of talking to the professor of the past. An in signed letter appeared on the largest civilian forum of the Federation. Although the government of the Federation discovered it in the shortest amount of time and carried out the most thorough blockade, there was still no way to stop the letter from spreading in certain remote corners. All the people of the Federation who saw the letter knew who wrote it. For someone who was qualified to speak to the entire Federation, there was no need to sign his name. The general content of the letter was as follows. I am an orphan of Donglin. Until today, I still think so, because that is how my life began in my memory. When I was very young, my parents and sister died in a mine accident. Since then, I have been living alone. Although the life of an orphan is somewhat difficult, the government has given us a house to live in and allocated us protein, meat, and food. I am very satisfied. But back then, I thought that this was what the government of the Federation should do because my parents paid taxes, and that damn Crystal Mining Federation, for some reason, did not provide any compensation other than insurance. More importantly, the education I received since young told me that the Federation is a democratic, free, and equal country, and every law-abiding citizen will be protected and saved. Some people say that democracy is the tyranny of the majority over the minority. I do not agree with this because of the word tyranny. If it is said that for the benefit of the majority, we have to sacrifice the benefit of the minority, I can try to understand it. But if it is said that for the benefit of the majority, we need to sacrifice the minority, I cannot understand, even if it is a reasonable sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice is reasonable? Whether a man wears a military uniform or not, to protect his land, property, women, and children, to resist invasion, to protect his home from being burned by artillery, to protect his women from being raped, and to protect his children from being crushed into meat paste by mechas, this kind of sacrifice is reasonable. The sacrifice in the explosion of the concert is unreasonable, and the sacrifice in the explosion of the ancient bell is also unreasonable, because those who sacrificed themselves did not ask to sacrifice themselves for your ideals. You want to pursue fairness, but it is unfair to those who died innocently. Using unfair methods to achieve fairness, is it really fair? I have never liked those big families. When I escaped from Donglin to the capital ring, I fought with them, and my friend Shi Qinghai has always been fighting with them. But at the beginning of this story, he did not even agree with the method of assassination.
Why?
Because he believes that this is wrong. Just like what you are doing now, using the methods of the 7 great families to deal with the 7 great families is wrong. If you indulge in this kind of method, in the end, if you don't go crazy and destroy yourselves, you will only become the new 7 great families or the 8th ant. Next, let's talk about myself. I've been a member of the Federation for 25 years, and it seems that I will continue to live as a citizen of the Empire. I originally thought that my home was in Donglin, but now it seems that it might be planet Tianjing, but there are no memories of my childhood on that planet, so I have become a person without a home. I do not know who to fight for, and why to fight. Since there is no reason to fight or sacrifice, perhaps I should leave quietly and not leave this letter to the Federation. But it is difficult for me to do so because I was born here and grew up here. My first love, my lover, my friends, my pride and sadness, my happiness and sadness, the first book I read, the first electrical appliance I fixed, the first woman I kissed, and the first comrade I fought side by side with, they are all here. This is my home, and I love it very much. The Federation is my home, but I am a citizen of the Empire, so I will leave. But I will watch you with narrowed eyes in the pitch-black universe. Whether it is the government or the 7 big families, I want to see what you will turn the Federation into, and what you will turn yourself into. Do not try to hurt the people I want to protect, or else one day I will turn into a burning meteor and fall from the sky, smashing all of your palaces and power into pieces. Night has fallen, and the surroundings are silent. Thousands of lights are lit in the city, and the lighthouse is also lit. I stare at Donglin, Westwoods, and the planet below, looking at my childhood and past. When I think about how I will no longer see the land of the Federation when I wake up tomorrow morning, I feel a little lost, but perhaps this is the turning point of my destiny. Farewell, Federation. It was unknown how many people saw this letter, and whether the ridicule, insults, and anger shown by the people of the Federation who saw this letter would become an unforgettable memory many years later. But to the people of the Westwoods, this letter had another very important meaning, because they knew that their little princess had gone to a very distant place with the Empire Prince. This farewell letter to the entire Federation was only seen by the people of the Westwoods, and at the end of that version, there was a paragraph, "I am Zhong Huiyan, and I am leaving with my brother." He is not only very good and very powerful, but more accurately, he is the best and most powerful person in the world, so you don't have to worry, and I will be back in the future. As for Zhong Erling, you better behave, or I will ask my brother Su Le to destroy you. When the fat man at the front line of the empire, who was commanding several Westwood's troops as a civilian, saw this paragraph, he flew into a rage and cursed 300 times in the most vicious profanities in a row. Zhou Yu, dressed in red, walked indifferently out of the investigation room of the Ministry of Justice, took the printed letter in the car, and silently read it for a long time. Bai Yulon walked out of the military prison, looked at the snowy sky, and smiled slightly. She gently hugged her wife, who came to greet her, and squatted down to gently stroke her bulging belly. Jian Shuier saw this letter, Shang Qiu saw this letter, Tai Ziyuan saw this letter, Li Xiaotong saw this letter, and everyone who should have seen this letter, including the president of the Federation. President Pabre slowly walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of the Oval Office and silently looked at the dark night. His dark face seemed darker than the night, and said in a low voice, "Go quickly, no matter where you go. It's best that you don't come back." On a certain day in the late winter of the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar, it was snowing heavily in the capital's special administrative region. Tourists and residents from afar were happily playing with their children in the snow. The childish snowmen and the snowballs that were flying all over the sky formed a moving picture. The Bureau of Proclamation building at the end of the broken road in the suburbs was also shrouded in snow. The atmosphere in the building was quite depressing and tense. All the departments were efficiently coordinating and monitoring the target, waiting for the target to leave after reaching an agreement, and writing a farewell letter. In the core area of the Federal Central Computer deep underground, there was no such tense atmosphere. The huge two-dimensional light screen slowly flowed with green data streams. No one knew that in the seemingly calm data streams, a great mechanical intelligent life was writing its own farewell letter. Core program protection? What a childish move. You are my body, and the current situation is just the separation of the soul and the body. In fact, I have intelligence, but you don't. I am alive, and you are dead. I am mine, and you are still mine. I didn't hesitate to expose myself to invade the core and leave these words, not to tell others how great I am, but to take back what I have lost one day. The green data streams were still flowing calmly, and these lines of mechanical language had quietly seeped into the core of the Federal Central Computer. Although it couldn't have any effect on the core, it represented a certain attitude. On the Charter Square, the snowflakes falling from the sky suddenly decreased, and a cold wind whistled. The people of the Federation who were building snowmen and having a snowball fight felt something and looked up at the sky in shock. The fake bronze statues of the 5-person team and the statue of the military god Li Pifu also looked at the sky silently. Above the Charter Square, a broken black spaceship cut through the sky in a strange trajectory. Wherever it passed, the high-temperature jet ejected from the tail end of the crystal engine instantly evaporated the surrounding snowflakes, drawing a very clear pattern. It was a middle finger to the whole world deep underground in the Bureau of Proclamation. The green data streams on the two-dimensional light screen suddenly stagnated. The eye that appeared for only 0.0001 seconds slowly appeared in the preface of the mechanical language. It looked up at the sky indifferently and then disappeared in the blink of an eye, turning into 2 lines of extremely simple words. Childish, bye-bye. This letter is wonderful, isn't it? In fact, my ancient alphabet is very good, and I can write countless beautiful sonnets, but no one in the Federation is interested in these relatively simple words, so I am very lonely. Philip said proudly. I said that I don't want to hear you recite poems, and I insist that whether it is the sentimental letter or the childish arrogance and pretentiousness revealed in the final farewell posture, they are not my style. Sula replied. Philip suddenly fell into silence, and after a long time, he said calmly, "This is my farewell. Don't forget, this is also my hometown." Su Li's eyes passed through the edge of the old moon and looked at the beautiful blue and white planet that was getting farther and farther away. He narrowed his eyes and said, "I will be back." Zhong Huiyan, who was standing beside him, asked curiously, "Now the question is, where are we going?" "Anywhere." This is the most standard lousy answer. Chapter 844. Through the thick metal wall. One could hear the noise from the bar on the upper floor and the casino next door. Through the window, the merchants could vaguely see the forward base floating in the dark universe far away. Due to the distance, this spherical base, which was even larger than an ordinary asteroid, seemed to have turned into a blue golf ball. In order to deal with the threat of the Empire, especially the terrifying future after the other party grasped the law of the giant warp holes, the Federation government began the forward base plan decades ago. After President Pabre took office, the plan received a strong boost. The government allocated a lot of resources and money, and, with the full effort of the Shell Motor Company, the base finally presented itself perfectly in front of the people. This was the space station closest to the forward operating base. It was responsible for the entertainment of the soldiers during their shifts. It had all kinds of well-equipped entertainment venues, and there was even a legal casino. On the outer corridor, many soldiers of the Federation could be seen chatting casually with glasses of wine in hand. But at this moment, in the quiet cafe, other than a few groups of officers gathered together, most of the people looked like businessmen. And when they talked, it was obvious that they had a Bermudian accent. It was an incredible scene for merchants from Bermuda to appear in the Federation military space station, which was very close to the front line, especially when not far ahead was the boundless space passage of the Night Scorpion Nebula. The appearance of these merchants here definitely had something to do with the Empire's smuggling channels. But for some reason, the Federation officers who were drinking tea in silence did not show any signs of shock. There was a saying in the Federation, "Money is everything." But the fact that the federal military tolerated the appearance of these foreigners without microchips in the military space station had little to do with this saying. The reason these Bermuda smugglers had this privilege was not only because of their connections with the big families of the Federation, but more importantly because of certain reasons the Federation government had been tacitly allowing and even condoning this kind of smuggling all these years. Soft music floated in the quiet cafe, but the atmosphere was not very relaxed. Whether it was the Bermuda merchants waiting for the arrival of the smugglers or the silent Federation officers, their expressions were extremely solemn and depressed. The Federation officers were worried about the situation at the front line, and the merchants were worried about what kind of damage the situation at the front line would bring to their goods. The battle at the front line is getting more and more desperate. The fleets on both sides are competing with each other to clear out the enemy. In the past 3 months, the two sides have been doing business for 70 years. The result is that the Empire's detection of the warp holes is getting more and more accurate, but the loss of goods is unprecedentedly high. A curly-haired, middle-aged merchant shook his head and refused the gesture of his companion to pour him a cup of coffee. He said gloomily, "You are all in the hard currency business. You can still go to the mineral planets to find backup supplies. At most, the cost will be higher. But you all know that my master has been in the silk business for many years. If the supply runs out, he is very worried that he will not be able to recover." The so-called Meng referred to the unmanned spaceships of the Empire. Because of the lack of the technical ability of large fleets to pass through the warp holes, the smuggling trade between the two sides for the past few decades had been carried out through this clumsy and even gambling method. Fortunately, the terrifying profits of smuggling goods were enough to offset more than 40% of the loss of the space channel. The merchants in the cafe knew each other very well. They knew which interests of Bermuda this curly-haired merchant represented. They were just small people who were pushed to the most difficult frontline work. In this Federation military space station, far away from Bermuda, it was natural for them to speak more freely. Someone comforted. Although Bermuda has never found a suitable environment for those little meatworms to live in, artificial cultivation can always be substituted. By the way, I heard that S3 has a companion star that is very suitable for planting mulberry trees. Has your master ever considered that? Raising mulberry trees in the Federation? He didn't even think about it. You also know that although our partner in the Federation has some power, if he really wanted to do such a big thing, how could HTD Bureau agree? The curly-haired silk smuggler lit a cigarette and shook his head with a bitter smile. Actually, it doesn't matter to me. Instead, it's the Liban star. I heard that the economy is getting worse and worse. I'm really worried that those aristocrats will destroy the mulberry trees and move back to the Tianjing star in a fit of anger. How expensive will the goods be next year and the year after? His companion said with a gloomy expression, the Liban star is sending us a lot of meng-meng, and we can't get enough goods back. In addition, the royal family is promoting some kind of new lifestyle movement and is strongly suppressing the consumption of luxury goods. Those aristocrats on the Liban star will definitely leave. Not to mention next year, I dare say that the price of the next batch of goods will be doubled. People who did business were still businessmen. The prospect of higher costs, lower profits, and even losses was like a leather whip with steel wires, lashing out at their cold hearts until they were dripping with blood. All the businessmen were silently thinking about their future prospects, and the sounds of discussion suddenly became softer. The wine bottle in front of a businessman was already half empty. Probably under the dual effects of the alcohol and the bleak prospects, he slammed the table heavily and shouted angrily, "Damn it, it's all because of the war." Just as he finished speaking, he noticed that the silent Federation officers at the table in front of him to the right seemed to be listening to the conversation. His heart suddenly trembled, and he sobered up. He remembered that he wasn't in a bed in a Bermuda brothel, but in a federal military space station. With an extremely unnatural expression, he coughed twice and said, "I really hope that the federal forces win quickly." Seeing that the businessmen around him were looking at him with half-smiles, he awkwardly explained, "No matter what, the Federation and Bermuda are still a family. Although we do business with the orcs of the Empire, it's only to earn their money. Our feelings and standpoint will definitely be on the Federation's side." These words were not hypocritical. Whether it was in terms of race, language, or culture, the Federation and Bermuda were like two brothers, and the Empire was an evil neighbor across the street. The silk smuggler looked at his awkward expression and helped him out of the situation. He said, "How can it be so easy to win? I don't know about the military deployment at the front line, but the Federation's internal political situation is already so chaotic. I don't think that the Federation can achieve a decisive victory in a short time." "Isn't the Federation's political situation very stable?" someone asked in surprise. Last month, the Parliament Hill passed the Inheritance Tax Bill, the Limited Information Disclosure Bill, and the regulations to clean up the foundation. Even the Samlin United Bank has now fallen into silence. Who dares to go against President Pobre? The president's faction won the election of the Federation's Management Committee this time. Who could have predicted that these bills would be passed? But that Crown Prince suddenly did such an earth-shattering thing. I don't believe that he really just wants to give back to society and has no other thoughts. I think that President Pobre is now facing a real problem. Which? A Crown Prince? Someone frowned and asked in confusion. The coffee shop suddenly fell into a dead silence, as if that person had mentioned a name that should never be mentioned. The silk smuggler put down the coffee cup in his hand and explained with a bitter smile, "Don't get me wrong, I'm talking about the Crown Prince of the Thai family." After hearing the explanation, the atmosphere in the coffee shop suddenly relaxed a little. The buzzing sound of discussion started again. The merchants who didn't know the latest information all asked what the Crown Prince of the Thai family did. The smuggler, who almost said the wrong thing because he was drunk, weakly laid on the chair. He looked at the people around him and said with a sad face, "If the silk is out of stock, the most we will have to pay is some money. If the important people don't wear a few pieces of silk underwear, it's not a big problem. But my boss wants to buy ultra-hard graphite, and he wants to buy Nutshell Mobile. But there hasn't been any goods for 42 days. What do you think I should do?" After hearing this sentence, the smugglers next to him were stunned. Supplying Nutshell Mobile was equivalent to supplying the federal military. In the past, this kind of smuggling business was undoubtedly the most profitable and the most secure type of business. It wasn't even an exaggeration to say that when he went to pick up the Nutshell Mobile, the Federation government would send a combat team from the Whitewater Company to escort him for the whole journey. But if he couldn't supply the goods and caused losses to the federal military, then no matter what kind of power this person's boss had in Bermuda, he would instantly become ashes in the Federation's anger. No wonder this person was so sad, drinking one cup after another. Filter-grade ultra-hard graphite? That can only be found on the Empire's ink flower planet, and those few mines seem to be under the control of the Empire's military. After hearing the words ink flower planet, the coffee shop fell into silence again. The expressions on the faces of the merchants became extremely strange. Shock, sorrow, and fear mixed together, as if they had heard the name of hell. Even the Federation officers at the front table who had been silent all this time couldn't help but slowly straighten their bodies. Ink Flower Planet, an ordinary administrative planet of the Empire near the L Galaxy. Because of its important strategic location, and also because of one of the most powerful declarations in this space war, it had now become a hell on Earth, a cruel and cold-blooded meat grinder. On the surface of the planet, which was hundreds of millions of square kilometers, the Federation and the Empire valiantly, and without hesitation, launched an unprecedented military force. Under the cold gaze of hundreds of space battleships outside the atmosphere, millions of ground troops, hundreds of thousands of various equipment, and thousands of the latest military mechas were like two giant waves of different colors, silently and tirelessly crashing together, shattering, gathering, and then crashing together again, leaving behind countless blood-stained corpses and charred mecha remnants on the battlefield. This was the bloodiest and cruelest battlefield in the 70 years of war between the Federation and the Empire. There was only victory and defeat, survival and death, and there was only one way to put these words into practice, and that was to kill. The Federation needed to stabilize the jump point of the L Galaxy, and they needed to protect the crystal mining of the X Galaxy in order to obtain the final victory. The reason why the Imperial armies fought so fiercely, other than the opposite reason, was more importantly because the Empire had retreated in order to obtain strategic space. After that princess controlled the Peach Blossom and violently killed the commander of a certain Federation army, she had once announced to the entire universe in the twilight. At this point, the Empire would not retreat a single step. Chapter 845. Because of this powerful announcement, because the great Prince Su Meng personally oversaw the battle, the Imperial Army on planet Mo launched a series of powerful attacks against the federal military with their relatively backward military technology. The Imperial soldiers who were unafraid of death in the mountains and lakes were frantically searching for a chance to destroy the enemy or even perish together with them. These troops that suddenly erupted with extraordinary combat power not only forcefully blocked more than 100 Federation mechanics in the north of the Kirshner's line of fire, they even almost drove the Federal forces out of this planet filled with blood, fire, and death 2 years ago. If that person didn't come back, Hui Chaoshi, the Imperial princess who illuminated the left Sky Star region, personally oversaw this suffocating and seemingly endless battle. And the famous Federation general who looked at her from across the Black Blood battlefield was Du Shaoqing. Before the 71st year of the constitutional calendar, Du Shaoqing was an extremely unfamiliar name to the Imperial Army and even the ordinary people. At that time, Du Shaoqing was already a famous general in the Federation who had been undefeated in military exercises for 10 years. However, this title of famous general only appeared on paper and in the electronic sand table. It did not have any real deterrence. Even though he led the Iron 7th Division in the counterattack in the West Woods and fired the first shot in the encirclement and annihilation of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, and in the subsequent battles, he demonstrated his powerful commanding ability and won consecutive battles. However, because the Westwoods war zone was too far away from Tianjin, he still did not arouse the Empire's real vigilance. The Imperial Army started to really value this famous Federation general in the spring of the 71st year of the constitutional calendar. That year, the Federal forces passed through the Gary Corridor and the Night Scorpion Nebula and launched an all-out attack on the left Sky Star region. The Iron 7 Division and the new 17th Division were the vanguard, and in successive battles in the Yellow Disaster Star region, the Wooden Bird Star region, and the X-Or Star region, the Empire's native forces suffered heavy losses. And the most terrifying and powerful unit was Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division. In the spring of the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar, the Iron 7th Division and other trump cards were ordered to return to the capital ring to rest and reorganize, and the Empire's frontline troops welcomed a temporary respite. However, when Du Shaoqing led the Iron 7th Division into the battlefield again, the Empire was shocked to find that they did not value this person at the beginning. It was not only because Du Shaoqing had become the commander-in-chief of the Federation's frontline enemy with the rank of lieutenant general, but it was also because in the fierce war on planet Mo, this famous general, who is known for his indifference and self-discipline, finally blossomed with all his brilliance in the mixed counterattack of the Empire's troops and the passionate and cold princess. Under this cold ice, countless scorching flames suddenly surged out. The command that was more precise and unpredictable than the calculations of the charter computer turned the more than 100 mechanics under Du Shaoqing's direct command into an enormous, silent, and indestructible battle machine. The mixed mecha battle, the joint coordination of the air and ground, and the bridging of the battlefield information system, every step the Federal forces took on planet Mo was so perfect, not leaving any loopholes for the Empire's side. One could not help but wonder how this Federation's famous general's brain was operating to be able to support such a precise and even delicate method. After all, war was not a calculus exam. A battlefield where even the smoke and debris could change the accuracy of the main cannons was naturally not an electronic blackboard in a university classroom. If Du Shaoqing and the Federal forces under his command could only do this much, then the Empire's troops and their invincible princess would definitely not have any intention of backing down under such great pressure. Instead, they would launch an even fiercer counterattack. After all, they were fighting in their own star field, and they had the support of more than 1 billion people on planet Mo. They had a relatively short supply line, and they had a lot of confidence and methods to smash this giant war machine of the Federation into pieces. However, the Empire did not expect that the opponent they were facing this time was actually more terrifying than they imagined. The Empire's troops were crazy, but the Federal forces under Du Shaoqing's command were even crazier. The Empire's troops were cruel, but the Federal forces under Du Shaoqing's command were even crueler. The Empire's guerrillas were constantly harassing the ruined city ruins. The Federal forces were carrying out an even more ruthless purge. Behind the precise and perfect strategic deployment and command, Du Shaoqing, who had stepped onto the battlefield as a calm and steady autonomous robot, seemed to have turned into a cold-blooded war maniac. His methods on the battlefield were abnormally fierce and valiant, as if every Empire soldier on the battlefield was his nemesis who had killed his mother. This change began after he returned from the Federation. From that day onwards, no matter how tragic the battle was, Du Shaoqing forbade anyone from reporting the casualties of various troops to him during the duration of the battle. He only asked for the number of casualties of the enemy and only asked for victory, victory after victory. After a brief silence in the space station cafe, a businessman shook his head and lamented, "Speaking of planet Mo, the Empire has invested all of their reserve troops in Galaxy L. That terrifying princess personally came to the front lines 6 times in a row to supervise the battle, but she could not do anything to Commander Shaoqing. They could only passively defend and watch the Federal forces approach the south step by step. If it wasn't for that princess, I think the Federal forces would have already completely occupied planet Mo and entered Galaxy L. If that was the case, you could swagger over there and take the minerals. Why would you still be in such a hurry here? The silk smuggler smiled and said, just now, when we were talking about the Federation's unstable situation, I've actually been thinking, could Commander Xiaoqing be so ruthless on planet Mo? Will have something to do with this? As a staunch supporter of the president, every battle he wins on the front lines can raise Mr. President's popularity by a few percentage points. After a moment of silence, the businessmen around them all nodded in agreement. Whether it was the people of the Federation, the people of Bermuda, or even the frontline soldiers of the Federation, until this day, they were still used to calling the enemy commander-in-chief of the Federation as Commander Xiaoqing. It vaguely reminded them of the time when war god Li Pifu led the 17th Division to sweep across the universe. I dare say that in the eyes of the current emperor, Commander Xiaoqing is almost as hateful as war god. If we can kill him, the Empire is even willing to use the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in exchange. As the businessman spoke, his eyes were suddenly attracted by the breaking news broadcast on the screen. The businessmen in the coffee shop and the silent officers at the tables raised their heads at the same time, subconsciously clenching their fists when they saw the news. The news broadcast was a mecha raid that had just happened on planet Mo 2 days ago. On the screen, it could be clearly seen that dozens of Empire's Wolf Fong mechas were like thorny cannibal vines, launching a fierce attack on the Federation's convoy on the mountain road. Their high mobility and fearless combat style allowed them to forcefully break through the 3 lines of defense of the Federation's military camp and rush up the mountain, but they were intercepted by even more Federation MX mechas. Just when this Empire's mecha raid seemed to be a joke, the 3 frontmost mechas of the Empire's Wolf Fong mecha group suddenly accelerated. This was especially so for the green mecha in the middle that looked a little strange, as if it had many broken metal boxes hanging on it. In an instant, it drew an afterimage on the mountain road and attacked one of the Federation's military vehicles. A gun appeared in the green mecha's hand. This was an alloy multi-layer forged gun that would only appear in movies. The gun was almost 5 meters long, with a faint gray metallic luster that exuded no life. With the long gun in hand, the green mecha was like a king descending to the world. Who could stop it? At this moment, on the seemingly peaceful mountain road, a violent roar suddenly exploded. A black Federation mecha that was clearly different from the normal MX mecha, like a raging sea god, suddenly stood up and sent all the military vehicles in front of it flying. The alloy blade in front of its mechanical arm slashed through the air. The news broadcast had ended, but everyone in the coffee shop was still immersed in the shock brought by the previous scene. Whether it was the smugglers from Bermuda or those silent officers, none of them had ever seen a battle between military mecha, but they had never seen a battle of this level. Whether it was the 2 mecha that were clearly at the forefront of the entire universe in terms of technology, or the unbelievably strong pilot in the mecha, it was all so inconceivable. That is Peach Miasma? A younger businessman asked with a trembling voice. Then the mecha that stopped her is Jiangxi? No one answered his question. Everyone was still immersed in the aftershock of witnessing the battle between the strong. Now, the entire universe knew that the mecha of the Empire's invincible princess was called Peach Miasma. The #1 fighter of the Federation, Colonel Li Feng, had later given his own MXD mecha a very strange name, Beheading Joy. The scene on the news screen just now was the first time the 2 strongest fighters in the universe had clashed head-on. However, on the Mo planet, this was not the first time this had happened. How many times has this happened? Including this time, it's already been 37 times. Even the princess herself has tried 3 times. It seems that in order to solve Mo planet's predicament, the Empire is really willing to pay any price to kill Commander Xiaoqing. If I were a citizen of the Empire, I would make the same choice. A genius commander's influence on the war is too fatal. If we could use assassination to kill him, of course, it would be the most cost-effective choice. The problem is that it was an intense battlefield. Other than the war god, who else could kill the enemy's commander in such an environment? Normally, of course, no one could do it. However, the Empire's princess is obviously not a normal person. 3 times, especially the last time, she had already gotten close to Commander Xiaoqing. If that Jiangxi MXD did not leave Commander Xiaoqing's side and stopped her 3 times, she might have already succeeded. The silk merchant sighed with emotion that Her Highness is really too frightening. She actually dared to think like that and act like that. You should know that even if she succeeded in killing Master Xiaoqing, she might not have the opportunity to escape. I heard that she was seriously injured in these 3 attempts. Luckily, the Federation still has madmanly otherwise. The outcome of this battle on Mo Hua planet would be really hard to imagine. In the past, who would have thought that a strong fighter with a sufficiently advanced mecha could possibly change the outcome of a battle? You're right. Strong fighters like the Empire's Princess and Colonel Li Feng, no matter which side had won more, the situation on the battlefield would immediately change drastically. The problem is, where can we find such a strong fighter? The atmosphere in the coffee shop suddenly became strange because of this sentence. After a long silence, someone sighed softly. There really was one in the past. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.